Good evening, dear listener. I hope this finds you nestled somewhere comfortable, perhaps already settling beneath warm covers or resting in your favorite chair as the day's demands finally release their grip. There's something particularly soothing about exploring ancient history at the edge of sleep, isn't there? The centuries between us and those long-ago lives create a gentle buffer, allowing us to observe without urgency, to wonder without worry. Tonight, I invite you to let the modern world fade away. The bright screens, the endless notifications, the tomorrow's tasks that try to claim space in your mind even now. Instead, let us journey together to a place where time itself moved differently, where sacred duty was measured not in minutes, but in decades, where young girls became living symbols of an empire's hopes and fears. Take a deep breath with me now. Release it slowly. And as you do, imagine the weight of 2,000 years lifting away, carrying us back to ancient Rome. In the heart of that eternal city, where marble columns cast long shadows across sacred stones, there existed a house where time moved differently. Not in any mystical sense, you understand, but in the way that all sacred spaces seem to exist apart from the ordinary flow of daily life. The Atrium Vestae, as it was known, stood near the Forum Romanum, that great center of Roman public life, where senators debated, merchants haggled, and citizens gathered to hear the latest proclamations. But while the Forum pulsed with the urgent rhythms of empire, the House of the Vestals maintained its own ancient tempo, measured not in hours or days, but in the slow, steady breathing of an eternal flame. I know that some of you come to these stories seeking escape from insomnia's cruel grip, while others simply enjoy the gentle exploration of forgotten worlds as you drift toward dreams. Whatever brought you here tonight, you are welcome. There's no need to concentrate too hard or remember every detail. Let the words wash over you like warm water, carrying away the day's tensions and troubles. Perhaps you've seen fire before. Campfires crackling in the darkness, candles flickering on dinner tables, the blue flames of a gas stove dancing beneath a kettle. But the fire that burned in the Temple of Vesta was different. It had burned, so the Romans believed, for over 1,000 years. Through the rise and fall of kings, through the birth of the Republic, through civil wars and conquests that stretched Roman power from the rain-soaked hills of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, this flame continued its quiet consumption of sacred wood, tended by hands that changed with the generations, but maintained the same careful, practiced movements. Feel your breathing beginning to match that ancient rhythm, steady, measured, continuous. There's nowhere else you need to be right now. Nothing else requiring your attention. Just you and me, and this story unfolding as gently as smoke rising toward stars. The smoke from this eternal fire rose through a hole in the temple's roof. The temple was round, you see, not rectangular like most Roman temples, echoing the shape of the primitive huts where the earliest Romans had kept their household fires burning. That smoke, gray-white against the Italian sky, dispersed into the air above the city, carrying with it the prayers and hopes of an entire civilization. For the Romans believed, with that peculiar mixture of superstition and practicality that characterized their religion, that as long as the sacred flame burned, Rome itself would endure. But who tended this flame? Not priests, as you might expect, nor soldiers tasked with guard duty. The responsibility fell to a group of women. Though to call them simply women fails to capture their unique position in Roman society. They were the Vestal virgins, 6 in number, chosen as young girls to serve the goddess Vesta for 30 years of their lives. 30 years! Consider that span of time for a moment, though not too intensely. Just let the number settle into your consciousness like a stone sinking slowly through still water. Empires can rise and fall in 30 years. A newborn can grow to have children of their own. The face in the mirror transforms from smooth youth to the first lines of middle age. And through all those years, these women maintained their virginity, their ritual purity, and their sacred duties with a dedication that seems almost impossible to our modern minds. If you find your thoughts wandering to tomorrow's obligations, to today's unfinished business, gently guide them back to ancient Rome. There's a certain comfort in contemplating lives so distant from our own, isn't there? Their worries cannot touch us. Their dramas have long since played out. We can observe with the detachment of archaeologists, examining potsherds, finding patterns and meaning without the weight of immediate consequence. Yet perhaps what seems most impossible is not their celibacy or their dedication, but the price of failure. For buried beneath the Roman Forum, archaeologists have found small underground chambers, barely large enough for a person to stand upright. These chambers, constructed with the same careful masonry that built Rome's great monuments, served a single, terrible purpose. When a Vestal virgin was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, whether the accusation was true or merely political, she was not executed in any ordinary sense. The Romans, with their deep respect for religious law, could not spill the blood of a sacred virgin. Instead, they found a solution that satisfied both legal precedent and religious scruple. They buried her alive. Even this dark truth we can examine with calm curiosity, can't we? The centuries cushion us from its immediate horror, allowing us to ponder rather than recoil, to question rather than judge. The question whispers across the centuries, as soft and insistent as smoke rising from an eternal flame. Why? Why did Rome, that most practical of civilizations, insist on this elaborate system of sacred virginity? Why did families surrender their daughters to 3 decades of service? Why did the city that conquered the known world tremble at the thought of the sacred flame dying? And why, when these women failed, or were accused of failing in their divine duty, did Rome resort to such a methodical, horrifying punishment? To understand, we must descend into the particularities of Roman religious thought, that complex web of tradition, superstition, state propaganda, and genuine belief that held the empire together as surely as its famous roads. We must examine the daily lives of these women, the weight of their unprecedented privileges and their crushing restrictions. We must walk through their house, with its gardens and fountains and sacred precincts, understanding how architecture itself shaped their existence. We must consider what it meant to be simultaneously the most honored and the most confined women in Rome. But we'll explore all of this slowly, gently, like archaeologists brushing dust from ancient stones with soft brushes. There's no rush, no urgency. History isn't going anywhere, and neither are you. You're exactly where you need to be. The story of the Vestal virgins is not merely one of religious duty or state control. It is a story about the price of symbolic purity, about how civilizations create meaning through ritual, about the young girls who became living embodiments of Rome's power and vulnerability. It is about flames that must never die, and the human hearts that tended them, beating quietly beneath white woolen garments, counting out the years in ritual observance, while the city beyond their walls conquered and was conquered in turn. So settle yourself even more comfortably, as if you were sitting in the evening shade of a Roman garden, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into night. Let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. Let your breathing deepen. Let us speak of sacred flames and the women who tended them, of power constrained by tradition and tradition maintained by power. Let us explore why Rome buried its holy women alive, and what truths about human nature and civilization that terrible fact reveals. And remember, dear listener, you don't need to remember everything. You don't need to stay awake for every detail. If sleep claims you before our journey ends, that's perfectly fine. The ancient Romans believed in the restorative power of sleep. They even had a god for it, Somnus, whose gentle touch brought peace to troubled minds. So let these words be your gateway to rest, your path to peaceful slumber, as we begin our gentle exploration of lives lived 2 millennia ago. How Rome chose its sacred daughters. As we drift deeper into the world of ancient Rome, let your mind wander to a spring morning in the year, shall we say 23 BCE. The exact year matters less than the scene itself, which repeated with subtle variations across the centuries. The morning sun, that same sun that warms your face today, unchanged by the passage of empires, slants through the shuttered windows of a patrician home on the Palatine Hill. In one of the smaller bedchambers, a young girl of perhaps 7 years stirs in her sleep, unaware that this day will cleave her life into before and after. Her name might have been Claudia, or Julia, or Cornelia. The patrician families favored certain names, passing them down through generations like precious heirlooms. Let us call her Livia, a name that carries the weight of aristocratic tradition without binding us to any particular historical figure. As you breathe slowly and deeply, picture young Livia in her bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her small hands curled like shells beside her face. The selection process for Vestal virgins was as methodical as everything else in Roman religious practice. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome, a position that would later be absorbed by the emperors themselves, maintained careful records of eligible girls. The requirements were precise, inflexible, carved into tradition like words into stone. First, the girl must be between 6 and 10 years of age. Any younger, and she could not understand the commitment being made in her name. Any older, and, well, the Romans had particular ideas about purity and innocence that began and ended with extreme youth. Consider for a moment though not too intently. Just let the thought float through your consciousness. What it means to be 6 years old. The world is still painted in primary colors of immediate experience. Abstract concepts like 30 years, or sacred duty, or virginity exist only as words adults speak in serious voices. A 6-year-old knows the warmth of her mother's embrace, the taste of honeyed cakes on festival days, the simple joy of running through garden paths. She does not, cannot, truly understand what it means to pledge the next 3 decades of her unformed life to a goddess and a flame. But the requirements continued, each one narrowing the pool of candidates like a sieve filtering grain. Both parents must be living, patrimus et matrimus, as the formal language stated. This ensured the girl came from a stable, unbroken home, untouched by the ill fortune of premature death. Both parents must be free-born citizens, not merely freed slaves who had earned citizenship. The taint of servitude, even generations removed, disqualified a girl from sacred service. The physical requirements were equally exacting. And here we begin to see the Romans' obsession with perfection made manifest. The child must be free from any bodily defect, no birthmarks that might be seen as divine disfavor, no limps or stammers that might mar the perfect performance of ritual. Her hearing must be acute enough to catch every word of the sacred formulas. Her voice must be clear enough to pronounce the ancient prayers without impediment. Even her appearance mattered, not beauty in the conventional sense, but a certain pleasant regularity of features that would neither distract from nor disgrace the sacred rites. I imagine some of you are feeling drowsy now, and that's perfectly natural. The methodical nature of bureaucracy, even ancient bureaucracy, has a certain soporific quality. Let the details wash over you like a gentle tide, each requirement adding another layer to your understanding without demanding sharp attention. The Pontifex Maximus kept lists, you see, written on wax tablets or papyrus scrolls, updated as girls were born into eligible families, crossed off as they passed the age of eligibility or as circumstances changed. A father's death, a family's financial ruin, an elder sister's scandal, any of these could remove a name from consideration. The lists were consulted when a vacancy arose among the 6 Vestals, whether through death or the completion of a 30-year term of service. When the need arose, and here the historical sources become wonderfully, exhaustively detailed in that way ancient writers had of recording religious procedures, the Pontifex Maximus would select 20 girls from his lists. 20 young lives, 20 possible futures, 20 families about to face a choice that was not really a choice at all. For while technically a father could refuse to surrender his daughter to Vesta's service, such refusal carried consequences. Divine disfavor, social stigma, political ramifications that could ripple through generations. Picture now the scene as the Pontifex Maximus, dressed in his toga praetexta with its purple border, accompanied by lictors and lesser priests, arrives at each household. The parents have been given notice, a day, perhaps, 2, to prepare themselves and their daughter. Long enough to explain what can be explained to a child, not long enough to truly prepare for a separation that will last 3 decades. In Livia's house, the preparation takes on an almost dreamlike quality. Her mother, whose name the histories rarely bother to record, for what importance has a woman except as producer of children, spends the night before the selection in Livia's room. She tells stories, perhaps, of the goddess Vesta, trying to make sacred service sound like an adventure rather than an exile. She rebraids her daughter's hair with special care, knowing that if Livia is chosen, other hands will tend those dark locks for the next 30 years. The father, let us call him Marcus Livius, for Roman naming conventions were predictable in their patriarchal simplicity, maintains the stoic facade expected of a Roman paterfamilias. Yet, perhaps in the privacy of his tablinum, his study, he allows himself to feel the weight of what may come. To give a daughter to Vesta is an honor, certainly. It creates connections to the highest levels of Roman society, brings prestige to the family name. But it also means watching his little girl walk away, knowing he will see her only in formal contexts, knowing she will never give him grandchildren to carry on the family line. The morning of selection arrives with the particular quality of light that Rome enjoys in spring, clear but not harsh, warm but not oppressive. Throughout the city, 19 other families are experiencing the same tense anticipation. Some perhaps hope their daughters will be chosen, seeing opportunity in sacred service. Others quietly pray to household gods that the lot will fall elsewhere, that they will be spared this particular honor. The selection itself is a masterpiece of Roman religious theater. The 20 candidates are brought to the forum, to the house of the Vestals itself. Can you imagine, though imagination is perhaps too active a word for our purposes, can you let yourself drift into the scene? 20 small girls, dressed in their finest white tunics, their hair arranged in the simple style of unmarried maidens. Some cry, overwhelmed by the solemnity and strangeness. Others stare with wide eyes at the grand buildings, the crowds of observers, the priests in their regalia. The Pontifex Maximus speaks the ancient formula: I take you, beloved, to be a priestess of Vesta, to perform the sacred rites for the welfare of the Roman people. The words are in archaic Latin, barely comprehensible even to educated Romans of the classical period, preserved like insects in amber from the city's distant past. The power is not in understanding, but in tradition, in the weight of centuries pressing down upon the moment. But wait, I've moved too quickly to the selection itself. Let me circle back in that gentle, spiraling way that thoughts move when we're approaching sleep. Before the final choice, there were examinations. Each girl was questioned by the priests, though what a 7-year-old could meaningfully answer about her readiness for sacred service remains unclear. Perhaps they asked her to repeat simple prayers, to demonstrate basic coordination through ritual movements, to show that she could maintain composure in the presence of authority. The physical examination was conducted by the wives of priests, for Roman propriety would never allow male priests to inspect young girls' bodies. They looked for hidden blemishes, tested flexibility and strength, ensured that each candidate could withstand the physical demands of service. For the life of a Vestal, despite its privileges, included manual labor, grinding sacred salt, drawing water from holy springs, maintaining the eternal flame through long watches of the night. Some sources suggest, and here ancient writers become vague, whether from ignorance or delicacy, that signs and omens were consulted. The flight patterns of birds, the examination of sacrificial entrails, dreams reported by senior Vestals. The Romans rarely made important decisions without consulting the divine will, or at least appearing to do so. Politics and religion intertwined like smoke rising from two adjacent altars, impossible to separate, each lending authority to the other. Finally, and doesn't finally seem like too urgent a word for our purposes? Let us say eventually, for time in our story moves like honey from a jar, sweet and slow and golden. Eventually, the moment of selection arrives. By lot, by divine sign, by some combination of chance and careful political calculation, 6 names are chosen from the 20. For Livia, standing small among the other girls, the moment stretches like a held breath. The Pontifex Maximus reaches into an urn, bronze perhaps, decorated with scenes of Vesta tending the first Roman hearth. His hand emerges, holding a small token, a name inscribed on wood or metal. He reads, "Livia, daughter of Marcus Livius." The crowd murmurs approval. The Livii are an old family, respected with the proper conservative values. Livia herself may not understand what has happened, may only know that her mother, watching from the crowd of spectators, has begun to weep silent tears that could be joy or sorrow, or both mixed together like wine and water in a ceremonial cup. The Pontifex Maximus approaches her, this small girl who will become a bridge between the human and divine. He takes her hand, his palm dry and papery with age, hers small and slightly damp with nervous sweat. He speaks the formula of taking, ancient words that transfer her from her father's authority to Vesta's service. In Roman law, she dies to her family in this moment and is reborn as something else, something both more and less than an ordinary woman. Her hair, which her mother braided with such care that last morning at home, is now cut short, shorn like a sheep, some sources say, though others describe a more ceremonial cutting of a few locks. The hair will grow back, to be arranged in the elaborate style of the Vestals, the sex crines, 6 braids wound around the head in a fashion so ancient that even Romans of the classical period weren't sure of its origin or meaning. She is dressed now in the white stola of a Vestal, the long tunic that will be her uniform for 3 decades. A purple border marks her sacred status. Around her head is placed the suffabulum, the white veil that she will wear whenever she appears in public, marking her as separate, sacred, untouchable. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again, aren't we? That tendency to jump forward, to rush toward conclusions, it's so very modern, so contrary to the patient unfolding of ancient time. Let me return to those other 19 girls, the ones not chosen. They return home with their families to grow up in the ordinary way, to be married at 12 or 13 to men their fathers choose, to bear children, to manage households, to live the circumscribed but familiar lives of Roman matrons. Do they feel relief or disappointment? Do they sometimes wonder, years later, as they nurse babies or supervise slaves or stand beside their husbands at public ceremonies, what their lives might have been? The sources don't tell us. Ancient historians, almost exclusively male, had little interest in the interior lives of women who didn't make history through scandal or extraordinary virtue. But Livia, our Livia, now Vesta's Livia, walks away from her parents and into her new life. She is led to the house of the Vestals, that building I mentioned earlier, where time moves differently. She will sleep tonight in a small cell, narrow as a tomb, that will be hers for the next decade until she advances in rank and earns a larger chamber. She will cry, most likely. Even the Romans, for all their stern morality, expected tears from a child separated from her mother. Tomorrow, her training will begin. She will learn the rituals that stretch back to Rome's foundation, when Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin herself, gave birth to Romulus and Remus and set in motion the founding of the eternal city. She will learn to tend the flame that must never die, to prepare the mola salsa, the sacred salted flour sprinkled on every sacrifice in Rome, to draw water from the sacred spring using vessels that no profane hand may touch. But tonight, in her narrow bed, she is still just a little girl who misses her mother. The weight of 30 years, of sacred duty, of Rome's expectations, all of that will settle on her small shoulders gradually, like dust accumulating on temple stones, until one day she will wake and realize she has become what the ritual made her, a Vestal virgin, keeper of the flame, guardian of Rome's spiritual heart. As you drift closer to sleep yourself, perhaps you can hear the distant sound of that eternal fire crackling in its ancient hearth. Or perhaps it's just the settling of your own home around you, the small sounds that mark the passage of ordinary time in ordinary places. Either way, let the image of that small girl in her narrow bed remind you that all of history's grand narratives are made up of individual lives, individual moments of transition and transformation. Tomorrow, but tomorrow in our story, not in your waking life. Tomorrow we will follow Livia as she learns what it means to live in the house of silence, to move through days measured by ritual rather than desire. But for now, let her sleep, and let yourself follow her example, drifting down into dreams where time moves as slowly as it does in sacred spaces, where flames burn without consuming, where young girls grow old in service to powers greater than themselves. Daily rhythms in the Atrium Vestae. Dawn comes early to the Forum Romanum, even in winter. The first pale light touches the tops of the temples before sliding down columns like honey down a warm spoon, pooling in the spaces between buildings where shadows spent the night. In the house of the Vestals, the Atrium Vestae, to use its proper name, our young Livia has been awake for some time already. Not because anyone woke her, but because the body, that remarkable instrument of adaptation, has already begun to align itself with the rhythms of her new life. Let us explore this house together, you and I, moving through it as slowly as that morning light, examining each detail with the patience of archaeologists reconstructing a vanished world from stone and memory. The building itself is a rectangle, though rectangle seems too sharp a word for something so softened by gardens and colonnades. Perhaps we should say it is a space carved out of the busy forum, a pocket of tranquility in the heart of empire, designed to house 6 women and their attendants in a kind of splendid isolation. The entrance, and buildings, like stories, must begin with entrances, faces the Via Sacra, the sacred way that processions used on festival days. But this entrance is not for casual visitors. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced with bronze and marked with symbols of Vesta's sacred flame, open only for the Vestals themselves, for the Pontifex Maximus on his official visits, and for the slaves who serve the household. The message is clear, even to those who cannot read the inscriptions. This is space set apart, made different, made holy. Pass through those doors, in imagination only, for the physical doors rotted away centuries ago, and you find yourself in the atrium, the central courtyard that gives the building its name. Roman houses typically centered on such spaces, open to the sky, allowing light and air into the surrounding rooms. But this atrium is grander than any private homes, stretching 50 feet in length, surrounded by a 2-story colonnade of white marble columns. The columns themselves deserve our drowsy attention. Carved from Luna marble, that particularly pure white stone quarried in the mountains north of Rome, they stand 20 feet tall on the ground floor, with smaller columns above, creating a gallery where the Vestals could walk in contemplation or simply to catch whatever breeze might grace a Roman summer afternoon. The capitals, the decorated tops of the columns, feature acanthus leaves so delicately carved that they seem to tremble in non-existent wind. But I'm moving too quickly again, aren't I? That tendency to catalog, to list, to name, it's so very modern, so unlike the way the ancient mind would have experienced these spaces. Let me slow down. Let me breathe with you. Let me tell you how the morning light moves through this space. As the sun rises higher, it sends fingers of gold through the eastern colonnade, creating patterns on the floor that shift and change like slow music made visible. The floor itself is a wonder of tiny mosaic tiles, tesserae, the Romans called them, a word that sounds like rain on leaves. Black and white and a dozen shades of gray between, they form geometric patterns that please the eye without demanding attention. Here and there, more elaborate designs appear. A flame that seems to flicker despite being made of stone. A wolf that might be the she-wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus. Garlands of flowers that will never wilt or fade. In the center of the atrium, where in a normal house you might find an impluvium, a shallow pool to catch rainwater, the Vestals maintained something altogether more elaborate. Picture, if your drowsing mind can hold such images lightly, a garden of almost impossible perfection. Box hedges trimmed into geometric precision mark out beds where roses bloom in careful succession, ensuring that fresh flowers are always available for rituals. Lavender grows in purple profusion, its scent rising with the morning warmth to perfume the air. Small fountains, 3 of them, always 3, for the Romans found mystical significance in that number, send up gentle sprays that catch the light and break it into tiny rainbows. Young Livia, in her first months here, spends long hours in this garden. Not idle hours. Idleness is not permitted to Vestals, but hours of learning. She must memorize which flowers are sacred to which gods, which herbs can be used in purification rituals, which plants must never be brought near the sacred flame. An elderly slave woman, Greek by birth and learned in the ways of growing things, teaches her to distinguish between similar-looking plants by touch and smell, for mistakes in ritual preparation could have consequences both earthly and divine. Around this central courtyard, rooms open like chambers of a heart. Let me guide you through them, moving slowly, pausing to examine whatever catches our shared attention. To the east, where morning light enters first, lie the rooms dedicated to the Vestal's most sacred duty, the tending of the eternal flame. The Temple of Vesta itself stands separate, a short walk across a paved courtyard. But here in the house are preparation rooms, storage chambers for the sacred wood. Only certain trees could provide fuel for the goddess's fire, and the wood must be without blemish, without rot, without the holes that boring insects leave. Can you imagine the smell of that wood storage room? Dry oak and pine, cedar brought from distant mountains, fruit woods that release sweet smoke when burned. The logs are stacked with mathematical precision, each piece inspected and approved before being added to the store. Smaller kindling fills baskets woven from willow, always willow, for reasons lost to time but preserved in practice. The scent is resinous, clean, somehow both exciting and calming, like the promise of a hearth fire on a cold night. Adjacent to the wood stores, a workshop contains the tools of fire maintenance. Bronze pokers, their handles worn smooth by generations of hands. Tongs for adjusting burning logs without contaminating the flame with human touch. Special vessels for carrying embers when the fire must be moved or divided. Everything is kept scrupulously clean, polished until the bronze glows like gold, for neglect of tools is tantamount to neglect of duty. But we're becoming too focused on work, aren't we? Let me show you the living quarters, where our Livia will spend the human hours of her days and nights. The sleeping chambers occupy the upper floor of the north wing, arranged by seniority. The newest and youngest Vestals, those in their first decade of service, occupy small rooms barely larger than the beds they contain. Livia's room measures perhaps 8 feet by 6, with walls of plain plaster painted the particular shade of red that Romans favored, made from cinnabar ground fine and mixed with egg white. Her bed is narrow, as I mentioned in our previous moments together, but not uncomfortable. The frame is wood, strung with rope webbing that supports a mattress stuffed with fresh straw, changed monthly. Over this, a feather bed provides softness. Goose down, most likely, for the Vestals, despite their vows of chastity, are not required to embrace discomfort. Clean linen sheets, wool blankets dyed the purple of privilege. A single pillow filled with herbs that promote peaceful sleep and pleasant dreams. Against one wall stands a simple chest for her possessions. What does a 7-year-old Vestal virgin possess? The regulations are specific, yet somehow touching in their allowances for childhood. She may keep toys, a doll perhaps, with jointed limbs and real hair, dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing. A set of knuckle bones for playing the games all Roman children knew. A ball of colored leather carefully stitched. These remnants of ordinary childhood seem almost heartbreaking in this context, don't they? But the Romans, for all their stern virtue, understood that transitions must be gradual, that a child cannot become a sacred vessel overnight. She also has her religious equipment, scaled to her small size. A miniature knife for cutting sacred herbs, its blade of bronze rather than iron, for iron is too base a metal for holy work. A set of measuring spoons for the exact proportions required in ritual preparations. A special comb for arranging her hair in the prescribed style, though for now her shorn head needs little attention. These items are stored with the same care given to the full-sized implements used by the senior Vestals, teaching from the beginning that in sacred service there is no such thing as an insignificant detail. As we drift through these private spaces, and I hope you're drifting with me, letting the descriptions wash over you like warm water, holding what interests you and letting the rest flow past. We come to the common areas where the 6 Vestals gather for meals and meetings. The dining room, or triclinium, breaks with Roman convention. Instead of the usual 3 couches arranged in a U-shape where diners would recline while eating, the Vestals sit upright at a table, maintaining the dignity proper to their status even while performing such mundane acts as eating breakfast. The table itself is a masterwork of cedar wood inlaid with ivory in patterns that tell the story of Vesta's arrival in Rome. Here, worked in precious materials by long-dead craftsmen, the goddess brings fire to the first Romans, teaching them to transform raw grain into bread, cold hearths into homes. The Vestals eat simple food: bread and olive oil, cheese and fruits, wine mixed with water in the proportions thought proper for women. Meat appears rarely at their table, and only from sacrifices where their portion has been divinely sanctioned. Breakfast in the house of the Vestals follows an unvarying pattern. The senior Vestal, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima to give her full title, enters first, taking her place at the head of the table. The others follow in order of seniority, each knowing exactly where to sit, how to arrange the folds of their stola as they settle onto chairs, when to reach for food, and when to wait. Conversation is permitted, but follows its own rules. They may discuss the business of the day, which sacrifices require their attendance, which rituals need preparation, which supplies must be procured. They may not gossip about the world beyond their walls, though news inevitably seeps in like water through stone. Livia, in her first weeks, barely speaks at these meals. She watches the older women with the intense attention children give to things they must learn but don't yet understand. How does Claudia Quinta, in her 20th year of service, manage to eat so elegantly while wearing the full ceremonial dress? Why does Terentia, the newest of the senior Vestals, always pause before drinking, her lips moving in what might be prayer or might be simple habit? What causes the Vestalis Maxima to frown at certain combinations of food, declaring them inauspicious for reasons no one explains? After breakfast comes the morning's work, and here the rhythms of the house reveal themselves most clearly. Like a great clock made of human movement and ritual obligation, the Vestals disperse to their duties with choreographed precision. 2 go to the temple to tend the flame. Always 2, for the flame must never be left with fewer guardians. Yet too many bodies in the small circular space would create confusion. 2 others descend to the storerooms to prepare the mola salsa, that mixture of salt and flour that sanctifies every Roman sacrifice. The preparation of mola salsa deserves our particular attention, for it illuminates so perfectly the intersection of the mundane and the sacred that characterizes Vestal life. The salt must come from the salt beds at the mouth of the Tiber, collected at specific times when the moon stands in proper relation to the tides. It arrives in rough crystals that must be ground in marble mortars, never metal, for metal would contaminate the purity. The grinding is work for strong arms and patient hearts, the pestle moving in circles that become a kind of meditation. The flour comes from ears of spelt wheat picked by the Vestals themselves on the Ides of May, when the grain stands full but not yet fully ripe. These precious ears are stored through the year, parceled out as needed. Each kernel must be inspected. Any that show signs of blight or insect damage are removed, for imperfection in the materials would render the final product ritually useless. The approved grains are ground in hand mills, bronze querns that turn with a sound like distant thunder. Young Livia's job in these early months is to sort. She sits at a table spread with white cloth, a pile of grain before her, and picks through kernel by kernel. Her small fingers, still soft with childhood, learn to detect the slightest irregularity of texture that might indicate corruption. Her eyes strain to catch the telltale discoloration of fungus. It is tedious work, the kind that makes the mind wander, but the senior Vestal supervising her has ways of maintaining focus. Each grain, she says, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years' service, is like a prayer. Would you offer a broken prayer to the goddess? Would you speak to her with corrupted words? The metaphor may be mixed, but the message is clear. Perfection in small things prepares the soul for perfection in great ones. The sorted grain goes to the grinding room, where two Vestals in their middle decade of service work the querns. The sound of stone on stone fills the space with rhythm, crush and turn, like the heartbeat of the house itself. The flour that emerges is fine as dust, white as the first snow on the Alban hills. It will be mixed with the prepared salt in proportions unchanged since Numa, Rome's second king, established them in the misty dawn of history. But I'm becoming too detailed again, aren't I? That tendency to zoom in on single processes when we should be painting broader strokes. Let me pull back. Let me show you the shape of the whole day rather than its individual moments. The morning passes in work and worship intertwined. At the third hour, mid-morning by our reckoning, the Vestals gather in their private chapel for prayers. Not the public ceremonies that require their presence in the temple, but intimate devotions, sung in voices that blend through years of practice into harmonies that seem to arise from the stones themselves. The prayers are in ancient Latin, so old that even educated Romans of the classical period need translation. But meaning matters less than continuity, less than the unbroken chain of voices stretching back to Rome's foundation. Lunch is taken quickly, often standing, for the afternoon brings public duties. Some days require attendance at sacrifices in the great temples of the Forum. The Vestals process from their house in careful formation, their white figures moving through the crowded streets like swans through muddy water. The people make way, some from respect, others from the superstitious fear that touching a Vestal might bring divine displeasure. They walk with eyes fixed ahead, neither acknowledging the crowd nor entirely ignoring it. maintaining that perfect balance between accessibility and remoteness that their position requires. On other days, they receive visitors in the tablinum, the formal reception room of their house. Here, unique among Roman women, they conduct business without male guardians. They can own property, make wills, buy and sell, loan money at interest. Roman matrons come seeking their intercession in legal matters. Merchants bring contracts for the Vestals to witness, knowing that documents sealed with their mark carry weight no ordinary witness could provide. Even senators might appear, hat in hand, metaphorically if not literally, seeking the support that these sacred women can provide or withhold. The tablinum itself speaks of power through understatement. Where a wealthy Roman's reception room would blaze with gilt and marble, the Vestal's version maintains an austere elegance. The walls bear frescoes, certainly, but they depict religious scenes rather than family triumphs. Aeneas carrying his father from burning Troy, Numa receiving the sacred shields from heaven, the she-wolf nursing the divine twins. The furniture is beautifully made but simple in design, the wood polished to mirror brightness but unadorned with ivory or precious metals. Livia, too young yet for business dealings, watches from doorways and corners. She sees how Terentia handles an importunate merchant who tries to wheedle better terms on a loan. She observes the Vestalis Maxima dispensing justice in a property dispute between two women who claim the same inheritance. She learns that power need not shout to be heard, that authority can wear white wool as effectively as purple silk. As afternoon wanes toward evening, the house returns to its private rhythms. The evening meal is more elaborate than breakfast or lunch, for Romans consider dinner the day's principal meal. The Vestals dine on fish brought fresh from Ostia, vegetables from their own gardens, fruits imported from every corner of the empire. They drink wine from the temple's own vineyards, stored in cellars that maintain perfect coolness even in August's heat. It is good wine, for the goddess does not demand that her servants drink vinegar, but it is always mixed with water in proportions that ensure dignity is maintained. After dinner comes the evening tending of the flame, different in quality from the morning's work. As darkness falls over Rome, the sacred fire becomes more than symbol. It becomes an actual light in actual darkness, a warm presence in the cooling night. The two Vestals on evening duty move through their tasks with special care, for everyone knows that darkness brings different dangers than day. Not physical dangers, no one would dare assault a Vestal, but spiritual ones. Night is when the Lemuras walk, the hungry ghosts seeking warmth and light. The sacred flame keeps them at bay, protects Rome from forces that rational Roman minds don't quite believe in, but won't quite dismiss. Livia's bedtime comes early in these first years, while she's still more child than priestess. A slave woman, the same Greek who teaches her gardening, helps her prepare for sleep. Her hair, what there is of it, is brushed. Her face and hands are washed with water scented with rose petals. She changes from her day stola into a sleeping tunic of soft linen. Prayers are said, simple ones that a child can understand, asking Vesta's protection through the night, blessing the flame that burns while Rome sleeps. But sleep doesn't come immediately to a 7-year-old in a strange bed, does it? In the darkness of her small chamber, Livia lies awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Footsteps in the corridor as the older Vestals go to their own chambers. The distant murmur of voices from the slave quarters, the splash of fountains in the atrium, constant as heartbeat, and threading through it all, if she listens very carefully, the whisper of the sacred flame in its temple, crackling and sighing as it consumes its offerings of wood and prayer. Does she think of home in these moments? Of her mother's face, her father's voice, the brother or sister she left behind? The sources don't tell us, focused as they are on ritual and regulation rather than the movements of young hearts. But we can imagine, gently, softly, without the sharp edges of active thought, that sometimes tears wet her pillow. Not desperate tears, for children adapt more quickly than we credit, but the quiet tears of adjustment, of acceptance, of a childhood bending itself to fit an adult-shaped destiny. The house of the Vestals sleeps, but not entirely. Always, through every hour of every night for more than 1,000 years, someone is awake, someone is watching, someone is feeding wood to the hungry flame. The vigil keepers change through the night. First watch, second watch, third watch, marking time not by mechanical clocks, but by the burning of measured logs, by the movement of stars across the oculus in the temple roof, by the internal rhythms that develop when life is lived by sacred routine. And so the cycle completes itself, ready to begin again with tomorrow's dawn. Day after day, month after month, year after year, the rhythms of the house shape its inhabitants like water shaping stone, slowly, imperceptibly, but with inevitable effect. Our Livia will grow within these rhythms, will find her childhood memories fading like morning dreams, replaced by the deeper patterns of ritual and duty and sacred time. But that transformation lies in the future of our story. For now, in this eternal present moment we're sharing, she is still a small girl learning to live in a house where silence has weight, where every action carries meaning, where the difference between sacred and profane is as clear as the difference between flame and darkness. Let her sleep, and let yourself drift towards sleep as well, carried by the rhythms of this ancient house where time moves differently, where young girls grow old in service to forces larger than themselves, where the flame burns on and on and on. The 3 decades of divine service. Time in the house of the Vestals does not move as it does in the world beyond the sacred walls. Outside, merchants rush to close deals before sunset. Soldiers march to the rhythm of campaigns that flame bright and brief as summer lightning. Politicians rise and fall with the turning of seasons. But within these precincts, time flows like sacred oil poured over stone, slow, deliberate, measured not in days or months, but in decades of transformation. Let us follow our Livia through these 30 years, though follow suggests too much haste. Rather, let us drift alongside her journey like smoke from the eternal flame, spiraling upward through the years, catching glimpses of a life lived in ritual time. As you breathe slowly, deeply, imagine those 30 years not as a burden to be endured, but as a river to be navigated, with its own currents and calms, its own hidden depths and sun-sparkled surfaces. The first decade, from age 7 to 17, is called the time of learning, though learning seems too simple a word for the profound reshaping that occurs. When Livia first arrives, she knows only the prayers a Roman child learns at her mother's knee, simple formulas to household gods and ancestral spirits. By the time 10 years have passed, she will have memorized thousands of lines of sacred text, will speak fluently in the archaic Latin of Numa's age, will move through rituals with the unconscious grace of long practice. But I'm leaping ahead again, aren't I? That modern tendency to summarize, to condense, when what we need is the patience to watch things unfold like flowers opening to the sun. Let me slow down. Let me show you how this transformation happens day by day, year by year, in increments so small they're barely visible, yet as inevitable as the erosion of marble by rain. In her 8th year, Livia masters the art of waking before dawn without external prompting. The senior Vestal assigned as her mentor, let us call her Caecilia, a woman in her final decade of service, teaches through example rather than instruction. Each morning, Caecilia's footsteps pass Livia's door at precisely the same time, marked not by any mechanical device, but by the internal rhythms developed through 20-odd years of practice. At first, Livia relies on a slave to wake her, but gradually, mysteriously, her body learns the lesson. One morning, she opens her eyes in the darkness and knows, without knowing how she knows, that Caecilia will pass her door in exactly the time it takes to dress. The sacred formulas come slowly at first. Latin is Livia's native tongue, but the Latin of the prayers is something else entirely. Words preserved from Rome's dawn, when the city was little more than mud huts clustered on 7 hills. Hocus pocus, children in distant futures will say, not knowing they echo the sacred formula, hoc corpus, transformed through time and forgetting. But for Livia, each syllable must be perfect, each accent precisely placed. A mispronounced prayer is worse than no prayer at all, for it might offend rather than appease the divine. Picture, if your drowsing mind can hold such details lightly, young Livia in the practice room, repeating the same phrases hundreds of times. The room is small, windowless, designed to focus attention inward. The walls are painted black, unusual for Roman interiors, to minimize distraction. A single oil lamp provides light, its flame a younger sibling to the eternal fire in the temple. Caecilia sits on a simple stool, listening with eyes closed, her face revealing nothing until the smallest error breaks the flow. Again, she says, not unkindly, but with the implacability of stone. And Livia begins again, her child's voice shaping sounds that were ancient when Troy fell, that will echo through centuries until Latin itself becomes a dead language preserved only in ritual and scholarship. The formula for purifying the temple after an intrusion. The word spoken when drawing water from the sacred spring. The invocation that begins each day's tending of the flame. Each must be learned, not just in sound, but in meaning, in the proper mindset for utterance, in the bodily postures that accompany them. By her 9th year, Livia's fingers have learned their own vocabularies. The way to hold the ritual knife when cutting sacred herbs, firm but not tight, angled just so to catch the morning light on the bronze blade. The precise motion for sprinkling mola salsa on sacrifice. 3 times, always 3, in a pattern that describes an invisible triangle over the offering. The technique for testing whether water is pure enough for ritual use, letting 3 drops fall onto a bronze mirror and reading the signs in how they spread or hold their shape. The mathematical precision required would surprise those who think of ancient religion as mere superstition. Everything must be measured, counted, verified. The wood for the sacred fire must be cut to exact lengths. 1 cubitus for the morning feeding, half that for afternoon, double for the nighttime vigil when cold makes the flame hunger for more. The proportions of salt to flour in the mola salsa never vary, 3 parts to 1. Ground together until the mixture is fine as dust, but not so fine that it loses its essential granular nature. Numbers permeate every aspect of Vestal life. 6 priestesses serving for 30 years. 6 times 5, a number rich in symbolic meaning. 3 decades of service, each with its own character and requirements. 9 yards of wool in the stola, neither more nor less. 7 knots in the sacred rope that binds certain ritual objects. The Romans found divine meaning in such precision, seeing in mathematical relationships the same order that kept the stars in their courses and the seasons in their proper sequence. Let me tell you about the water. For water plays a part in Vestal duties that moderns might not expect. Not just any water will suffice for sacred purposes. It must come from the spring of Juturna, there in the Forum, where the divine twins Castor and Pollux watered their horses after bringing news of victory at Lake Regillus. But even this sacred water must be carried in the proper vessels. Earthenware jars made specifically for this purpose, their clay mixed with ash from the previous year's ritual fires. Young Livia learns to carry these jars on her head, as Vestals have done since before memory. It's harder than it looks, balancing a water-filled vessel while walking with the measured pace required by dignity. The neck must be straight but not stiff, the spine aligned just so, the arms positioned for balance without seeming to struggle. Dropped water means starting over. Not just the physical journey to the spring, but the ritual purification that must precede any sacred act. In her 10th year, something shifts in Livia's understanding. The individual rituals, learned by rote and performed by habit, begin to connect into a larger pattern. She sees how the morning purification prepares for the noon sacrifice, how the noon sacrifice enables the evening prayers, how the evening prayers protect the nighttime vigil. The cyclic nature of sacred time reveals itself, not as abstract concept, but as lived experience, felt in the body as much as understood by the mind. This is also the year she first assists with the public rituals, standing behind the senior Vestals as they perform ceremonies before the eyes of Rome. The weight of those eyes, hundreds, sometimes thousands, watching from the Forum, might paralyze an adult, but children possess that peculiar unconsciousness that allows them to perform without self-reflection. Livia holds the bronze vessel while Cassilia pours libations. She carries the basket of mola salsa in processions. She stands motionless for what feels like hours while prayers drone on in the archaic tongue. The people watching see a small figure robed in white, her face grave with concentration beneath the suffibulum. They see the future of their city's spiritual protection, the next link in an unbroken chain stretching back to Rhea Silvia and forward to, well, they assume forever. For what is Rome if not eternal? They don't see the mosquito bite on her ankle that itches terribly, or the way her legs tremble with the effort of standing still, or how she must bite the inside of her cheek to keep from yawning during the endless recitations. Years pass in this rhythm of learning and practicing and performing. By her 11th year, Livia moves with the unconscious grace of someone raised in ritual space. She can walk through a crowded room carrying a brimming vessel without spilling a drop. Not through conscious care, but through muscle memory so deep it operates below thought. Her voice, beginning to deepen from child's piping to woman's timbre, shapes the ancient prayers without effort. But physical mastery is only part of her education. The Vestals must also understand law, for they serve as witnesses to wills and contracts, keep state documents in their archives, and enjoy legal privileges unique among Roman women. Livia studies with a jurisconsult who comes to the house 3 times per week, a dusty old man who speaks in paragraphs and smells of the wax tablets he constantly consults. Roman law, as you might imagine, or rather as you might let wash over you without the effort of imagination, Roman law is a thing of beautiful complexity. Built up over centuries, layer upon layer, like geological strata, it combines ancient custom, religious prescription, and practical innovation in proportions that vary depending on which jurist you consult. The Vestals must understand not just the current interpretations, but the historical development, for their privileges rest on precedents so old that forgetting their origins might mean losing their force. Take, for instance, the Vestals' exemption from tutela, the legal guardianship that constrains every other Roman woman from birth to death. Ordinary women pass from father's control to husbands, or, if widowed, to the supervision of male relatives. They cannot make contracts, cannot appear in court, cannot dispose of property without male approval. But Vestals, by virtue of their sacred status, stand outside this system. They are sui juris, under their own law, their own control. The old jurisconsult explains this through examples that make Livia's young head spin. Consider, he drones, the case of Claudia Quinta, Vestal in the year 465 from the founding of the city, who inherited 3 apartment buildings from a grateful freedman whose will she had witnessed. Under ordinary circumstances, a woman could not. And on he goes, through precedent and exception, principle and application, until the specific case disappears into the general fog of legal theory. By her 13th year, as her body begins the changes that transform girl into woman, Livia faces new challenges in maintaining ritual purity. The Romans, like many ancient peoples, viewed menstruation as a form of pollution incompatible with sacred service. But the Vestals, practical as in all things, developed accommodations. During their monthly courses, they withdraw from direct contact with the most sacred objects, but continue other duties. It's a lesson in adaptation, in finding ways to serve despite the body's inconvenient insistence on following its own rhythms. This is also when she begins to understand the weight of the vow she took, or rather, that was taken for her at age 7. As her body develops, as she watches through the windows of the house while young men and women in the forum walk together, as she lies awake feeling stirrings she has no context to understand, the meaning of virginity shifts from abstract concept to lived reality. The senior Vestals, wise in the ways of guiding young women through this transition, provide occupation for restless minds and bodies. Extra duties, longer prayers, physical exercise in the private gymnasium, where Vestals maintain the strength needed for their tasks. By her 15th year, Livia has grown tall, though not remarkably so. Her face has lost its childish roundness, revealing the strong bones that will carry her through decades of service. Her hair, shorn so drastically 8 years ago, now reaches nearly to her waist when unbound, though it spends most of its time in the elaborate 6-braided crown that marks a Vestal. She moves through the house with confidence born of long familiarity, knowing every stone, every shadow, every echo. The rituals that once required fierce concentration now flow naturally. She can prepare mola salsa while carrying on a conversation about the proper interpretation of lightning omens. She can tend the sacred flame while simultaneously instructing newer girls in their duties. The multitasking that develops from years of layered responsibilities becomes second nature, though she would not use that modern term. She would simply say that the goddess grants her servants the abilities they need. In her 16th year, a scandal rocks the Vestal community. One of the senior priestesses, not Caecilia, who remains above reproach, but another whose name history has mercifully forgotten, is accused of incestum, the violation of her vow of chastity. The accusation comes from a senator with political motivations, but that doesn't make the trial any less serious. In her 16th year, a scandal rocks the Vestal community. One of the senior priestesses, not Caecilia, who remains above reproach, but another whose name history has mercifully forgotten, is accused of incestum, the violation of her vow of chastity. The accusation comes from a senator with political motivations, but that doesn't make the trial any less serious. For weeks, the house operates under a cloud of suspicion and fear. The accused Vestal maintains her innocence, but innocence and proof of innocence are different things in Roman law. Livia watches the proceedings from a careful distance, too young to testify, but old enough to understand the stakes. The trial takes place in the Regia, the office of the Pontifex Maximus, with senators sitting as judges. Evidence is presented, a slave's testimony that the accused left the house at unusual hours, a love poem allegedly in her handwriting, the suspicious generosity of a certain young patrician toward the Vestal order. It's all circumstantial, but in matters of religious purity, circumstance weighs heavily. The verdict, when it comes, is guilty. The sentence is the ancient one, the terrible one that gives our story its dark heart. But I'll save those details for later, when we explore more fully the price of broken vows. For now, know only that Livia watches as her sister priestess is led away, watches as the remaining 5 perform purification rituals to cleanse the order of contamination, watches as a new girl is selected to fill the vacancy. The lesson is clear. The honors of Vestal service come with costs that compound over time like interest on a loan from the gods. As her first decade of service draws to a close, Livia participates in the ceremony that marks her transition from learner to practitioner. It's a small ritual, witnessed only by her sister Vestals and the Pontifex Maximus, but its significance reverberates through her bones. She recites the full corpus of sacred law from memory, performs the complete sequence of daily rituals without supervision, demonstrates her mastery of every skill from fire tending to legal documentation. Caecilia, her mentor these 10 years, presents her with the implements of full Vestal status. A new stola with the purple border slightly wider than a novice's. A bronze knife with her name inscribed on the handle. A set of keys to parts of the house previously forbidden. "You have learned well," Caecilia says, and coming from someone who praises as rarely as rain falls in August, the words carry weight. But even as Livia celebrates this milestone, she understands that learning never truly ends. The second decade brings its own challenges. The full weight of ritual responsibility, the delicate negotiations of Vestal influence in Roman politics, the constant vigilance required to maintain both actual purity and the appearance of purity, which in Rome amounts to the same thing. She is 17 now, no longer a child, but not yet tested by the full measure of years. The river of time flows on, carrying her deeper into the currents of sacred service. The second decade, the time of performing, begins with subtle shifts in responsibility. Where once Livia followed, now she leads. Where once she watched, now she acts. The morning she first tends the sacred flame alone, without supervision, her hands tremble slightly as she selects the wood, as she adjusts the burning logs with the bronze poker, as she speaks the prayers that ensure Vesta's continued protection of Rome. The flame responds to her touch as it has to countless Vestals before her, neither judging nor welcoming, simply consuming what is offered and transforming it into light and heat and sacred smoke. Days develop their own momentum when you're responsible for maintaining them. Livia rises now without effort in the pre-dawn darkness, her body's internal sundial more accurate than any water clock. She performs her ablutions, washing face and hands in water drawn the evening before, arranging her hair in the complex braided crown, donning the stola that has become as natural as skin. By the time she reaches the temple, the eastern sky shows the first blush of dawn, and the flame greets her with its eternal whisper. The physical demands of full Vestal service would surprise those who imagine priestesses living in decorative idleness. The sacred flame consumes enormous quantities of wood, each piece of which must be carried up the temple steps, arranged properly in the sacred hearth, adjusted as it burns. The preparation of mola salsa requires hours of grinding, the mortars and pestles heavy enough to build significant muscle over time. Drawing water from the sacred spring, carrying it in the approved vessels, distributing it for various ritual uses, all of this is physical labor disguised as religious service. By her 20th year, Livia's body has adapted to these demands. Her arms show definition beneath the white wool of her stola. Her hands, once soft with childhood, now bear the calluses of daily work, not the rough calluses of field labor, but the specific marks left by ritual implements used thousands of times. There's a permanent indentation on her right thumb from the handle of the bronze poker, a slight thickening of skin on her left palm from the grinding pestle. But the physical changes are nothing compared to the mental and spiritual evolution. Where once she performed rituals by rote, now she understands, or believes she understands, their deeper significance. The fire is not just fire, but the living heart of Rome, pumping warmth and light through the body of the state. The water is not just water, but purification made liquid, washing away the accumulated spiritual grime of urban life. The mola salsa transforms mere grain and salt into something that sanctifies, that makes holy, that bridges the gap between human offering and divine acceptance. This understanding brings its own burdens. When you truly believe that your negligence might cause Rome to fall, every moment of tending becomes weighted with significance. Livia develops the hypervigilance common to those charged with impossible responsibilities. She checks the flame before sleeping, wakes in the night worried that she smelled smoke wrong, rises early to assure herself that all is well. The other Vestals, recognizing this phase of development, take turns talking her through the anxiety, sharing their own memories of similar fears. The goddess does not demand perfection, the Vestalis Maxima tells her one evening after Livia has checked the flame for the 4th time in an hour. She demands dedication. There is a difference. But the difference feels razor thin when you're 20 years old and convinced that the fate of civilization rests on your attention to detail. The public aspects of Vestal service become more prominent in this 2nd decade. Livia stands with her sisters at major sacrifices, visible to all Rome in their white dignity. She learns to hold herself motionless for hours while bulls are slaughtered, their blood caught in bronze vessels, their entrails examined for omens. She masters the art of processing through crowded streets without seeming to notice the crowds, maintaining that perfect balance between accessibility and remoteness that preserves the Vestal's mystique. There are privileges too, compensations for the restrictions. Livia attends the theater, sitting in the reserved section near the imperial box, if there is an emperor at this particular moment in our fluid timeline. She watches the comedies of Plautus, performed by actors who exaggerate every gesture for the groundlings in the back. But she must not laugh too loudly, must not show too much emotion. A Vestal's dignity extends even to her entertainment. At the races, the great chariot competitions in the Circus Maximus that send Romans into frenzies of factional loyalty, she sits with her sisters in seats of honor, watching the clouds of dust and the wheeling turns, the crashes that send drivers flying, the victories that spark riots of celebration. She may have preferences among the racing factions, the greens perhaps, or the blues, but she cannot cheer like ordinary spectators. Her presence is itself a kind of blessing on the proceedings, a reminder that Rome's sacred guardians are watching. The gladiatorial games present more complex challenges. The Vestals attend, as they attend all major public spectacles, but the bloodshed troubles some more than others. Livia learns to watch with composed features as men kill each other for the crowd's amusement, to give the signal for mercy or death when the editor of the games defers to the Vestal's judgment. It's said that Vestals always vote for mercy, but this is romantic nonsense. They vote as political and social circumstances dictate, understanding that their position requires pragmatism as much as piety. By her 25th year, Livia has developed the network of relationships that make a Vestal truly effective. She knows which senators' wives to approach with certain requests, which merchants can be trusted to provide quality goods for the temple, which freedmen have risen high enough to be useful allies, while remembering their origins enough to be grateful for attention. It's a delicate web of influence and obligation, maintained through careful correspondence and strategic visibility. The Vestal's correspondence deserves mention, for they conduct more secular business through letters than many might expect. Their archive contains not just wills and state documents, but letters from petitioners seeking intercession, from former Vestals maintaining connection with the order, from provincial officials requesting guidance on religious matters. Livia spends hours each week reading and responding, her handwriting growing more confident and authoritative with each year. One letter might be from a senator's wife, asking the Vestals to witness her will because she trusts them more than male relatives who might have interest in altering her bequests. Another from a veteran soldier, requesting that the Vestal's petition for his land grant to be honored despite bureaucratic obstacles. A third from a provincial priestess of Vesta in one of the colonial towns, seeking clarification on a point of ritual that local traditions have muddled. Each letter requires not just response, but consideration of implications. If the Vestals support this veteran's claim, will they be obligated to support others? If they witness this will, are they prepared to testify to its authenticity if challenged? If they provide this ritual clarification, does it set precedent that might bind future generations? The correspondence that seems routine carries weight that accumulates over time like sediment in a slow river. The sacred calendar structures the year as surely as the daily rituals structure each day. Livia learns not just to perform the ceremonies, but to anticipate their requirements. The Vestalia in June, when the temple is opened to Roman matrons for the only time all year, requires weeks of preparation. The storerooms must be cleaned, every implement polished, every surface purified. The Vestals themselves fast for 3 days before, ensuring their own ritual purity matches that of their sanctuary. During the Vestalia, Livia stands guard as Roman women file through the usually forbidden space. She watches their faces, awe, curiosity, desperate hope, as they whisper prayers for fertility, for their children's health, for their husband's success in business or war. Some leave offerings, not the blood sacrifices of public ritual, but personal tokens. A lock of hair from a sick child, a piece of jewelry worn on a wedding day, a small cake baked from the first grain of their own harvest. The Vestals collect these offerings, blessing each one before consigning them to the flame. By her 27th year, as her second decade of service nears its end, Livia has become what she once watched others be, a fully realized Vestal virgin, comfortable in her power and her restrictions alike. She moves through the days with the flowing confidence of someone who has found their place in the cosmic order. The anxieties of her early service have mellowed into appropriate concern. The rituals that once required thought now flow from her hands like water from a spring. But even as she reaches this pinnacle of active service, she knows that change approaches. In 3 years, she will enter her final decade, the time of teaching. Young girls will look to her as she once looked to Cecilia, seeking guidance in mysteries that cannot be fully explained, only experienced. The cycle that seemed impossibly long when she was 7 now shows its shape: beginning, middle, approaching end. Not that ending means what it might in ordinary life. After 30 years, she will face a choice that looms larger with each passing year: freedom to leave, to experience the life she set aside as a child, marriage, perhaps, and children, though bearing children at 37 brings its own risks, or continued service, remaining in the house that has become more home than any other place could be, tending the flame until death finally releases her from duty. But these are thoughts for future years. And in our drowsy exploration of Vestal life, the future exists only as potential, not pressing concern. For now, Livia lives in the eternal present of sacred service, each day much like the last, each year cycling through the same festivals and fasts, the same rituals and responsibilities. The river of time flows on, but in the house of the Vestals it flows in circles, always returning to the same sacred sources. The third decade brings its own qualities, like wine aging in sealed vessels, developing complexity and depth. Livia, at 27, knows she stands on the threshold of this final transformation. The goddess asks different things of her senior servants, not just the strength to perform, but the wisdom to guide, not just the knowledge to execute, but the understanding to teach. She will need to become not just keeper of the flame, but transmitter of the light, passing on to the next generation the accumulated understanding of centuries. As her 27th year gives way to her 28th, Livia sometimes pauses in her duties to observe the younger Vestals. There is Quinta, just 13, still awkward in her movements, still stammering over the archaic prayers. There is Tertia, 18, and beginning to feel the weight of her vows, the stirrings of desires that must remain unexplored. In them, Livia sees herself reflected and refracted, the same journey at different stages, the same river at different points in its course. Teaching begins informally, long before the official designation. When Quinta struggles with the pronunciation of a particularly difficult prayer, Livia finds herself offering the same patient correction Caecilia once offered her. When Tertia asks, in the careful way of someone testing boundaries, about the Vestal who was condemned 10 years ago, Livia provides the same measured response she received, neither condemning nor excusing, simply acknowledging that human failure exists even in sacred space. By 29, Livia has primary responsibility for one of the novices, a grave child named Claudia, who reminds her painfully of herself at that age. The same serious attention to detail, the same anxiety about performing perfectly, the same loneliness that comes from being separated from family before you're old enough to understand why. Livia finds herself softening in ways that surprise her, offering the gentle encouragements that Caecilia, in her austere wisdom, withheld. The goddess is patient, she tells Claudia, after the girl spills sacred water and bursts into tears of frustration. She has waited 1,000 years for our service. She can wait while you learn to carry water without spilling. It's not exactly what Caecilia would have said, but times change even in sacred space, and perhaps a little kindness doesn't diminish the dignity of service. The final year of her second decade passes with the strange acceleration that comes when you're approaching a significant threshold. Suddenly, there aren't enough hours to perfect all the skills she wants to pass on. Not enough opportunities to perform each ritual one more time as principal actor before stepping back into supporting roles. The year flies and crawls simultaneously, each day both too short and too long. On the night before her 30th birthday, or rather the anniversary of her entry into service, for sacred time supersedes secular, Livia keeps vigil in the temple. This is traditional, a night of meditation and reflection granted to each Vestal as she transitions between decades. She tends the flame alone, feeding it wood with hands that know exactly how each type will burn, adjusting the logs with movements so practiced they require no thought. In the flickering light, she reviews the 20 years behind and imagines the 10 ahead. The flame burns as it has always burned, caring nothing for human time, consuming the present moment and transforming it into heat and light and ascending smoke. In its constancy, she finds comfort. In its endless appetite, she sees a reflection of the goddess's endless requirements. In its warmth, she feels something that might be approval or might simply be the physical properties of combustion given spiritual meaning by human need. Dawn comes, as dawn always comes, even after nights that seem eternal. Livia rises from her vigil, stiff from hours of kneeling, and performs the morning rituals one last time as a Vestal in her second decade. Tomorrow, she will begin teaching in earnest, taking her place among the senior priestesses who guide rather than perform, who preserve rather than innovate. The river of time has carried her this far, and it will carry her on, through her final decade and beyond, to whatever shore awaits. But that tomorrow exists in the future of our story, and we are concerned only with this eternal present moment, this gentle exploration of lives lived in sacred time. Let Livia stand there in the dawn light, poised between past and future, between who she was and who she will become. Let the flame burn on, eternal and indifferent and absolutely essential. Let the cycle continue as it has always continued, world without end, until the empire itself gutters and fails and takes its sacred fires with it into history. The paradox of influence without freedom. As morning light filters through the columns of the forum, let us pause to consider a curious paradox that lies at the heart of the Vestal Virgin's existence. Here is Livia, now 30 years old, entering her final decade of service. She cannot leave the city without permission. She cannot marry. She cannot bear children. She cannot even dine with men outside her family. And yet, as she walks through the streets of Rome in her distinctive white garments, magistrates step aside, senators bow their heads, and even emperors, when Rome has emperors, show deference to her passing. How strange it must seem to modern minds, accustomed to equating power with freedom of movement and choice. But in ancient Rome, power flowed through different channels, pooled in unexpected places, and the Vestals occupied one of the deepest of these sacred pools. Their influence operated not despite their restrictions, but because of them. each limitation transforming into its own peculiar form of authority. Let your thoughts drift with mine through the labyrinth of Roman law and custom, where nothing is quite as simple as it first appears. The Vestals exist in a legal category all their own, sui juris, under their own law, yet not precisely free. They are neither the property of their fathers, as unmarried women were, nor of husbands, as married women became. They float in a strange space between categories, and in that floating find abilities denied to every other woman in Rome. Consider the morning's business. Livia sits in the tablinum of the House of the Vestals, reviewing documents with the careful attention her position demands. Before her lies a will, not just any will, but that of Lucius Cornelius, one of Rome's wealthiest merchants. He has chosen to deposit this crucial document with the Vestals rather than with any male relative or friend. Why? Because the Vestal's archive is inviolate. No magistrate may demand access. No heir may break the seals before their time. What the Vestals guard, they guard absolutely. The archives themselves occupy a fireproof chamber beneath the house, built with the paranoid care Romans lavished on protecting important documents. The walls are stone, the ceiling vaulted to resist collapse, the single entrance guarded and locked with mechanisms whose keys only the senior Vestals possess. Here rest not just private wills, but state secrets, treaties with foreign powers, sacred formulas for addressing the gods, prophecies whose revelation might shake the foundations of Roman confidence. As Livia affixes her seal to the receipt for Cornelius's will, she exercises a power most Roman women could not dream of, the authority to execute legal documents without male supervision. Her seal, a carved gem showing Vesta's sacred flame, carries more weight in law than the marks of most magistrates. When she dies, many years hence, we hope, that seal will be broken from its ring and destroyed, ensuring no one can forge her authority. But while she lives and serves, it opens doors that would otherwise remain forever closed. The paradox deepens when we examine the Vestals' freedom of movement. Yes, they require permission to leave the city, but within Rome itself, they go where they please, when they please, accompanied only by a single lictor, the ceremonial attendant who also accompanies magistrates. Think about this for a moment, as deeply as your drowsing mind permits. Roman women of good family do not walk alone. They move in groups, surrounded by slaves and relatives, their every step watched and reported. But a Vestal walks with the confidence of official protection, needing no chaperone beyond the symbolic presence of state authority. This freedom extends to spaces otherwise forbidden to women. Livia may enter the Senate House, not to speak, for women's voices are not heard in that august chamber, but to observe from the special seats reserved for Vestals. She may visit the law courts, where her presence adds weight to proceedings. She may even, on certain ceremonial occasions, dine at public banquets, where the only other women present are there as entertainers. A very different sort of presence indeed. But perhaps the most striking of the Vestal's powers is one that seems almost mythical to modern sensibilities, the power to pardon. Picture this scene, which historical sources assure us occurred multiple times across the centuries. A condemned criminal is being led to execution. His route, by chance or design, crosses that of a Vestal virgin. The moment their paths intersect, the execution must halt. The Vestal may, if she chooses, declare the criminal pardoned, and her word supersedes all judicial proceedings. Of course, this power comes hedged with its own restrictions. The meeting must be accidental. A Vestal who deliberately seeks out condemned criminals to pardon would quickly find her influence curtailed. And wisdom dictates that the power be used sparingly, for Rome values justice as highly as mercy. But the mere existence of this ability speaks to something profound in Roman thinking about sacred virginity and its relationship to divine will. Livia has exercised this power exactly once in her 23 years of service. She was returning from the temple of Vesta Palatina, a secondary shrine on the Palatine Hill, when her path crossed that of a young slave being led to crucifixion for striking his master. Something in his desperate eyes, or perhaps in the divine promptings that Vestals learned to recognize, moved her to speak the formula of pardon. The slave fell to his knees, weeping. His master, though furious, could not contest the Vestal's authority. The boy lived, eventually earning his freedom through dedicated service, and sends offerings to the temple every year on the anniversary of his salvation. The economic powers of the Vestals deserve our drowsy contemplation as well. Unlike other Roman women who could not own property in their own names or engage in business without male oversight, the Vestals accumulate wealth with perfect legality. Their sources of income are various and sometimes surprising. The state provides generous stipends for their maintenance. Grateful individuals leave legacies in their wills, particularly those whose important documents the Vestals have guarded. The temple itself owns extensive properties, vineyards and farms, whose produce flows into Vestal coffers. Livia manages a portfolio that would make many senators envious. She owns apartment buildings in the Subura, Rome's crowded working-class district, where rents provide steady income. She has shares in shipping ventures, technically illegal for senators, but perfectly acceptable for Vestals. She loans money at interest, carefully, to borrowers whose reputation and collateral meet her exacting standards. All perfectly legal, all perfectly proper for a woman who exists outside the normal categories of female life. But wealth without the ability to spend it freely would be merely abstract power. Here, too, the Vestals enjoy unique privileges. While they must maintain appropriate dignity in their purchases, they face none of the restrictions that hedge ordinary women's economic activity. Livia may commission artwork for the temple, purchase rare manuscripts for the archives, even buy property in her own name, all without seeking anyone's permission or approval. The influence this economic power grants extends far beyond mere purchasing ability. When Livia chooses to support a particular merchant by purchasing from his shop, his reputation soars. When she withdraws her custom from another, whispers follow him through the forum. The Vestal's economic choices become moral judgments, their purchasing patterns interpreted as divine approval or displeasure. Political influence flows through channels even more subtle than economic ones. The Vestals cannot vote, cannot hold office, cannot speak in the Senate or courts. Yet their political power might exceed that of many who enjoy these formal rights. It operates through presence rather than participation, through implication rather than declaration. through the delicate manipulation of sacred responsibility. Consider how this works in practice. A senator planning to propose controversial legislation might seek the Vestal's blessing, not officially, for they have no formal role in politics, but informally, testing whether his proposal would meet with their approval. If a Vestal hints that the sacred chickens showed unfavorable signs this morning, or that the flame burned unsteadily during his visit, the wise senator might reconsider his plans. Livia has learned to navigate these waters with exquisite care. When the consul's wife visits, seeking divine favor for her husband's military campaign, Livia speaks of general principles, how the goddess favors those who protect Rome, how the flame burns brightest when the city stands united. She makes no specific promises, offers no concrete predictions, yet her words are parsed for meaning like oracle utterances. The Vestal's role as guardians of important documents grants another form of power. They know the contents of wills before they're opened, understand the secret provisions of treaties, hold evidence that could destroy reputations or topple governments. They never speak of these secrets. To do so would violate sacred trust and invite divine punishment. But the knowledge itself creates an aura of authority. Men who have deposited damaging documents in Vestal keeping treat the priestesses with extra deference, knowing what they know. This extends to their role as witnesses. Roman law requires multiple witnesses for various legal proceedings, and Vestal testimony carries special weight. They cannot be compelled to appear in court, another unique privilege, but if they choose to testify, their word is considered unimpeachable. Livia has testified 3 times in her career, each time in cases where justice seemed threatened by corruption or intimidation. Her simple statement of what she observed cut through webs of perjury like a bronze knife through shadow. The social influence of the Vestals operates in even more intangible ways. They set fashions without intending to. When the Vestals adopt a new style of fastening their stolas, within weeks Roman matrons throughout the city imitate it. They create social connections through their mere presence. To be seen speaking with a Vestal in the forum enhances anyone's reputation. They serve as unofficial arbiters of moral questions, their approval or disapproval carrying weight far beyond their formal authority. But all of this influence, this power that flows through such various channels, exists in constant tension with their fundamental unfreedom. Livia may own property, but she cannot travel to inspect her distant holdings without elaborate permissions. She may influence legislation, but she cannot marry the senator who seeks her counsel. She may accumulate wealth, but she must spend it always with an eye to maintaining Vestal dignity. The psychological effects of this paradox run deep. Some Vestals, historical sources suggest, become intoxicated by their influence, wielding it with increasing boldness until scandal or accusation brings them low. Others retreat into ritual observance, using their restrictions as shields against the temptations of power. Most, like Livia, find a middle path, exercising their authority within careful bounds, always conscious of the precipice that borders their elevated position. As afternoon shadows lengthen across the forum, Livia prepares for one of the social duties that come with her senior status. Tonight, she will attend a dinner at the home of a senator's widow, one of the few social occasions where Vestals may freely mingle with Roman society. She will sit in the place of honor, will have her food tasted first, as befits her sacred status, will find her every word remembered and analyzed. She will exercise influence through her mere presence, her careful words, her strategic silences. But first, she must return to the temple to ensure the flame burns steady for the evening watch. No amount of worldly power exempts her from this basic duty. No accumulation of influence or wealth can substitute for the simple act of feeding wood to fire, of maintaining the light that maintains Rome. In this, perhaps, lies the deepest truth of Vestal authority. It flows from service, not domination, from limitation accepted rather than freedom seized. The paradox of power without freedom, of influence through restriction, of authority born from sacred bondage. This is the reality Livia navigates daily. She has learned to find liberty within limits, to exercise will through accepted channels, to shape the world while standing still at its sacred center. Tomorrow, we will explore what sustains this delicate balance, what wisdom allows the Vestals to carry such contradictions without breaking beneath their weight. But for now, let her walk through Rome in her white dignity, powerful and powerless, free and bound, a living symbol of all the complex negotiations between human desire and divine demand. Sustaining faith through decades of duty. In the quiet hour before dawn, when Rome lies still beneath a blanket of river mist, Livia sits in meditation within the Temple of Vesta. She has tended the sacred flame for 23 years now, fed it wood and prayer in equal measure, watched it consume offerings and transform them into smoke that rises to heaven. But what of the other flame? The one that burns within, that must be tended with equal care, lest it gutter and fail, leaving only the empty motions of ritual without the animating spirit of belief. This is perhaps the most delicate question we might explore together in our drowsy contemplation of Vestal life. How does faith sustain itself through decades of repetition? What keeps the sacred sacred when you handle holy things daily? When mystery becomes routine? When the numinous must be scheduled between breakfast and the morning's correspondence? Let us approach this gently, as one might approach a sleeping dove, careful not to startle it into flight. Faith, in the Roman understanding, was not quite what later centuries would make of it. For Romans, faith, fides, meant something closer to trust, to reliability, to the keeping of contracts, both human and divine. The gods existed as surely as the Senate existed, and dealing with them required the same careful attention to protocol, the same scrupulous honoring of agreements. Livia's faith began as a child's acceptance of what adults told her was true. The goddess Vesta lived in the flame. The flame protected Rome. She, Livia, had been chosen to tend this flame. Simple propositions, accepted simply, as children accept that the sun will rise tomorrow or that spring follows winter. But 23 years later, what remains of that childish certainty? What has it become through the alchemy of time and experience? Consider the daily reality of her service. Every morning for more than 8,000 days, she has risen before dawn to check the flame. Some mornings it burns bright and steady, seeming to leap with joy at her approach. Other mornings it sulks low among the embers, requiring patient coaxing to return to full strength. She has learned to read its moods like a farmer reads weather, understanding which woods it prefers, how humidity affects its burning, why it flares during certain ceremonies and dims during others. This intimate knowledge might, in some minds, diminish the sense of sacred presence. When you understand the physical principles of combustion, when you know exactly how long an oak log of specific dimensions will burn, when you can predict with accuracy how changes in wind direction will affect the flame's behavior, does divinity dissolve into mere chemistry? For some Vestals across the centuries, perhaps it did. But for Livia, as for most who persevere in their service, understanding deepens rather than diminishes the mystery. She has developed what we might call a practiced mysticism, though Romans would not use such terms. It manifests in small moments of profound connection. Sometimes, in the deep watches of the night, as she feeds the flame alone in the circular temple, she feels presence beyond the fire's light. Not a voice, not a vision. Romans distrust such dramatic manifestations, but a settling certainty, as if the goddess had briefly touched her shoulder in approval. These moments come without warning and cannot be summoned by will. They might occur during the most solemn ceremonies, when incense smoke wreathes the temple and prayers echo in ancient cadences. Or they might arise during the most mundane tasks, while sweeping ash from the hearth, while measuring oil for the lamps, while instructing a young novice in the proper way to hold the ritual knife. The sacred, Livia has learned, does not always announce itself with trumpets. But faith requires more than occasional mystical touches. It needs daily sustenance, regular feeding, just like the flame itself. The Vestals have developed practices, some official, others personal, that maintain the interior fire through decades of service. Let me share with you some of these sustaining rituals, the ones that history records and the ones we can infer from the shape of lives lived in sacred dedication. First among these is the practice of meditation, though Romans would call it contemplatio. Each Vestal is encouraged to spend time daily in silent reflection, usually in the hours between afternoon duties and evening meal. Livia often takes this time in the garden of the Atrium Vestae, sitting beneath an ancient olive tree that was old when the house was built. She does not empty her mind, that is an Eastern practice that would puzzle Romans, but rather fills it with careful consideration of sacred things. She might contemplate the nature of fire itself, how it transforms but is not transformed, how it gives without diminishing unless starved of fuel, how it purifies through destruction, yet from destruction brings new creation. These are not abstract philosophical musings, but practical theology, ways of understanding divine action through observable phenomena. The goddess reveals herself through her element, and careful observation becomes a form of prayer. Sometimes she reviews the ancient stories, not as entertainment, but as instruction. How Vesta came to Rome with Aeneas, carried from burning Troy in the form of sacred embers. how Numa instituted the Vestal order, choosing virgin priestesses, because virginity, like fire, is pure potential, powerful precisely because it is contained. How various Vestals through history showed particular virtue or fell into spectacular vice. The stories create a context for her own service, placing her in a narrative that began before memory and will continue after forgetting. Physical practices also sustain faith. The Vestals maintain their bodies with the same care they show the temple, understanding that they themselves are vessels of sacred service. They eat moderately but well, avoiding excess while ensuring strength. They exercise in the private gymnasium attached to their house, nothing strenuous or unseemly, but enough to maintain the vigor needed for their duties. They bathe regularly in water heated by sacred fire, using oils scented with herbs sacred to various deities. This attention to physical well-being is not vanity, but theology. A sick Vestal cannot tend the flame properly. A weak one cannot carry the heavy vessels of water from the sacred spring. An exhausted one might make errors in ritual that could endanger Rome. The body serves the spirit by enabling service, and caring for it becomes another form of devotion. The relationships between Vestals provide another crucial support. Living together for decades, they develop bonds deeper than many families. They understand each other's struggles without explanation, provide encouragement without judgment, share the weight of sacred responsibility. When doubt creeps in, and it does, inevitably, in any life of faith, they support each other through it. Livia remembers her own crisis, somewhere in her 15th year of service. The repetition had become oppressive. The restrictions chafed like ill-fitting shoes. She lay awake wondering what life might have held if her father hadn't offered her to the goddess. Marriage, perhaps, and children, a house of her own to manage, freedoms she had never tasted and could only imagine. The flame seemed merely fire, the rituals empty gestures, the goddess an absence rather than a presence. It was Caecilia who guided her through, not with platitudes, but with practical wisdom. The goddess does not demand that we feel her presence constantly, the older woman said. She demands that we tend her flame constantly. The feeling follows the doing, not the other way around. And so Livia continued her duties, performing them with mechanical precision when she could not infuse them with faith, until gradually, like dawn breaking, the sense of meaning returned. The Vestals also sustained their faith through learning. The sacred texts they memorize in their first decade of service reveal new meanings when contemplated in the second and third. Prophecies that seemed obscure to a child of 10 resonate differently to a woman of 30. Ritual formulas repeated thousands of times suddenly disclose unexpected depths, as if the words themselves were seeds that required years to germinate. They study not just their own traditions, but the wisdom of other peoples. Greek philosophy filters into their discussions, carefully examined for compatibility with Roman tradition. Egyptian mysteries provide points of comparison. Even Jewish monotheism, with its invisible deity and portable religion, offers insights into the nature of divine presence. The Vestals, uniquely positioned outside normal social constraints, can explore ideas that might be dangerous in other contexts. But perhaps the most sustaining element of Vestal faith is the most paradoxical. The very restrictions that might seem to constrain belief actually preserve it. By removing the distractions of ordinary life, the negotiations of marriage, the dangers of childbirth, the economic anxieties of running a household, the Vestal system creates space for profound spiritual focus. The limitations become a trellis on which faith can grow upward toward the light. Consider how this works in practice. Livia cannot marry, so she need not worry about pleasing a husband or managing his household. She cannot bear children, so she need not fear death in childbirth or grief at a child's loss. She cannot leave Rome without permission, so she need not yearn for travels that might broaden her horizons, but would certainly complicate her duties. Each restriction removes a potential source of divided attention, allowing fuller focus on the sacred. This is not to say the restrictions cause no suffering. They do, particularly in the middle years when the body's demands are strongest and the end of service still seems impossibly distant. But the Vestals have developed ways of transforming even this suffering into spiritual strength. They speak of it as sacrifice, not the blood sacrifice of animals on altars, but the living sacrifice of possibilities foregone. Each pang of regret for unchosen paths becomes an offering to the goddess, transmitted through the medium of human will into divine favor. The rhythm of ritual itself sustains faith through a kind of sacred momentum. When you have performed the morning purification 8,000 times, the 8,001st carries the weight of all its predecessors. The accumulated practice creates its own meaning, like a path worn into stone by countless footsteps. Even when individual faith wavers, the faith of the institution carries the practitioner forward. And there is the flame itself, always the flame. Whatever doubts may trouble a Vestal's mind, the flame remains. It burns as it burned for her predecessors, as it will burn for her successors. Its needs are simple and absolute: fuel, air, attention. In tending to these needs, day after day, year after year, the Vestal participates in something larger than herself, older than memory, more enduring than any individual life. Livia has come to understand the flame as teacher as much as responsibility. It shows her the nature of dedication, constant, patient, but essential. It demonstrates the power of small actions repeated, each piece of wood contributing to an unbroken chain of light. It reveals the relationship between tending and being tended, for as she cares for the flame, she finds herself cared for by the structure of service that surrounds it. Now, in her third decade of service, Livia's faith has evolved into something different from either the simple acceptance of childhood or the questioned conviction of middle years. It has become embodied faith, lived rather than merely believed, practiced rather than simply professed. She no longer asks whether the goddess exists. The question seems as irrelevant as asking whether Rome exists. Instead, she asks how best to serve, how most faithfully to tend, how to prepare her successors for their own journeys through doubt toward dedication. The interior flame, she has learned, requires the same patient tending as its external counterpart. It needs regular fuel in the form of prayer, study, and contemplation. It needs the oxygen of community, the breath of shared purpose. It needs protection from the winds of doubt and the rain of despair. But most of all, it needs the simple daily act of showing up, of performing the next required task, of trusting that meaning accumulates like smoke rising from 1,000 offerings. Tomorrow, we will explore what happens when this carefully tended faith faces its ultimate test, when vows are broken, when the sacred is violated, when the price of failure is paid in the ancient currency of earth and darkness. But for now, let us leave Livia in her pre-dawn meditation, tending both flames with the patient skill of long practice, maintaining the light that maintains the world. The price of broken faith. The forum falls silent when they bring her through. Not the comfortable quiet of early morning or the drowsy hush of afternoon heat, but the terrible silence that descends when Rome witnesses the unthinkable, a Vestal virgin condemned for breaking her sacred vow. The crowd parts like water before her passage, some turning away, others staring with the horrified fascination humans reserve for the fall of the mighty. Let us approach this dark center of our story with appropriate gravity, yet without the sensationalism that usually attends such tales. For while the punishment of unchaste Vestals provides dramatic material for later storytellers, the reality was both more complex and more human than legend suggests. In Livia's 23 years of service, she has witnessed this procession twice. Each time, it carved something from her soul that would never quite heal. The first occurred when she was 17, still in her initial decade of service. The accused was Marcia, a Vestal in her middle years who had served with apparent devotion for 15 years before accusation found her. The charge came from a slave in her brother's household who claimed to have carried messages between Marcia and a young equestrian. Under torture, for slaves could only give legal testimony under torture, such was Roman justice, he provided dates, places, circumstances that seemed to form a pattern of guilt. The trial took place in the Regia, the house of the Pontifex Maximus, with the full college of pontiffs sitting in judgment. Livia, too young to testify but old enough to understand, watched from the doorway as Marcia stood before her judges. She denied everything with quiet dignity, but dignity alone cannot refute evidence, and the slave's testimony, extracted through pain, carried the weight of presumed truth. What followed was not execution in any simple sense. For Vestals, being sacred, could not be killed by human hands without bringing pollution upon the city. Instead, Roman law prescribed a punishment that maintained the fiction of divine rather than human judgment. The condemned Vestal would be carried through the city in a closed litter, like a corpse, for she was already dead to the world. At the Campus Sceleratus, the evil field just within the Servian wall, she would descend into a small underground chamber prepared for this purpose. The chamber itself embodied Roman precision in horror, large enough for a couch, a lamp, a small table, provisioned with bread, water, milk, and oil, enough for a day or two, no more. Once the Vestal descended the ladder, workers would seal the entrance with earth, leaving no marker, no sign that anyone lay beneath. Technically, Rome had not executed her. She had been given food, water, shelter. If the goddess wished to save her, surely divine power could open the earth. If not, Marcia went to her fate with the same dignity that had marked her trial. Livia watched from the windows of the atrium Vestae as the funeral procession passed. For it was a funeral, though the principal participant still breathed. The litter swayed slightly with its living burden. The crowd's silence was absolute. Even the vendors, who normally hawked their wares regardless of circumstances, held their tongues. That night, Livia couldn't sleep. She imagined Marcia in the darkness underground, the lamp burning through its small supply of oil, the bread untouched. Who could eat at such a moment? The walls pressing in with the weight of earth above. Did she pray? Did she curse? Did she simply sit in silence, waiting for the air to grow thick and thought to fade? The not knowing was almost worse than knowing would have been. The second time came just 3 years ago, when Livia had grown into the full authority of her middle years. This time, the accused was Licinia, and the circumstances were more complex. No slave testified against her. Instead, the charge arose from a series of troubling omens. The sacred flame had gone out during her watch, not once but twice. A crack had appeared in the temple floor. Birds of ill omen had been seen circling the regia. In themselves, such signs might mean nothing. Flames die when wood is damp or airflow is poor. Buildings crack as foundations settle. Birds fly where they will. But when the Pontifex Maximus consulted the Sibylline books, those ancient prophecies kept under strictest guard, the verses seemed to indicate that a Vestal's impurity had angered the goddess. The investigation that followed was thorough and terrible. Every aspect of Licinia's life came under scrutiny. Her movements were traced, her associations examined, her correspondence read. A pattern emerged, not of clear guilt, but of suggestions, implications, circumstances that might be innocent or might be damning, depending on how one chose to interpret them. She had been seen speaking at length with a certain senator in the forum, but Vestals often discussed business with senators. She had received expensive gifts, but grateful clients often showed their appreciation thus. She had seemed distracted during rituals, had been heard sighing in the night, had lost weight, but any of these might have explanations that had nothing to do with broken vows. The trial stretched over days. Licinia defended herself with passion and eloquence, pointing out the flimsiness of the evidence, the danger of condemning someone based on omens and suppositions. Some of the pontiffs seemed swayed, but the Pontifex Maximus, an old man who saw divine displeasure in every deviation from tradition, pressed for conviction. When the vote came, it was devastatingly close. Guilty by a margin of 1. This time, Livia was among the Vestals who prepared Licinia for her journey. In the small chamber where condemned Vestals spent their last night above ground, they dressed her in the full ceremonial robes, as if for the most solemn sacrifice. Licinia's hands shook as they arranged her hair in the 6-fold braids. "I am innocent," she said, not pleading, but stating fact. "The goddess knows I am innocent." What could they say? That they believed her? That belief changed nothing? That the goddess would surely intervene if she were truly innocent? All the formulaic comforts turned to ash in the mouth when faced with the reality of judicial death. They could only perform the last services in silence, each wondering if she might someday receive the same ministrations. The procession to the Campus Celeratus followed the same route Marcia had taken years before. But this time, Livia walked behind the litter as part of the official escort. She could hear Licinia's breathing within, quick and shallow with controlled panic. The crowd was the same, silent, horrified, fascinated. Some threw flowers, though whether in respect or mockery was unclear. At the evil field, they removed the temporary wooden structure that covered the entrance to the underground chamber. The latter descended into darkness that seemed to swallow light. Licinia emerged from the litter, pale but composed. She looked at each of her sister Vestals in turn, her gaze lingering on Livia. "Tend the flame well," she said. Then, without assistance, she descended. The sound of earth being shoveled onto the wooden ceiling of the chamber below, that sound haunts Livia still. Each spadeful was carefully placed, the workers performing their task with mechanical precision. No one spoke. When the ground was level, indistinguishable from the surrounding earth, they performed a purification ritual and departed. Within hours, foot traffic would erase any sign that the ground had been disturbed. It was as if Licinia had never existed. But she had existed, and her absence left ripples that disturbed the careful order of Vestal life for months. The novices whispered in corners, wondering if maintaining their vows was worth such a risk. The middle years Vestals examined their own conduct with paranoid scrutiny. Even the seniors seemed shaken, their usual serene authority cracked by the reminder that 30 years of faithful service could be erased by accusation and ambiguous evidence. The effects extended beyond the Vestal community. Some Romans muttered that the standards of proof had been too low, that condemning a woman based on omens and circumstance set a dangerous precedent. Others argued that the very existence of doubt proved guilt. Surely the goddess would not allow her pure servants to fall under suspicion. The flame itself seemed to burn differently after Licinia's burial, though whether dimmer or brighter depended on who observed it. These spectacular failures, for that is how broken vows were seen, as failures not just of individuals, but of the system meant to prevent them, throw into sharp relief the ordinary successes of Vestal life. For every Marcia or Licinia, hundreds of women completed their 30 years of service without scandal, tending the flame through decades of quiet dedication, maintaining their vows through whatever private struggles they faced. The system had safeguards, of course. The collective living arrangement meant privacy was nearly impossible. It would be difficult to conduct an illicit affair when your every movement was observed by 5 other women and dozens of slaves. The daily routine left little time for unsanctioned activities. The constant awareness of consequences created its own barrier to temptation. But the human heart has its own imperatives, and sometimes they proved stronger than fear or faith or carefully constructed barriers. When that happened, the punishment was swift and terrible, designed as much to deter others as to punish the guilty. The goddess demanded purity, Rome demanded security, and the price of failure was darkness and earth and slow suffocation in a tomb that was not called a tomb. Livia has thought often about those chambers beneath the Campus Celeratus. Are they still there, sealed and secret, containing the bones of women who may have been guilty or may have been victims of jealousy, politics, or simple misfortune? Do their spirits rest peaceful, convinced of divine justice? Or do they hunger for vindication that will never come? These are dangerous thoughts for a practicing Vestal, but the mind wanders where it will in the dark hours before dawn. The threat of such punishment shapes behavior in ways both obvious and subtle. Every interaction with men outside ritual contexts carries danger. A conversation that extends too long, a smile that might be interpreted as invitation, even a gesture of simple human kindness, all must be weighed against the possibility of misinterpretation. The Vestals move through Roman society armored in dignity and distance, protected by their sacred status, but also imprisoned by it. Some handle this better than others. The naturally reserved find it easier to maintain the proper boundaries. Those with warmer temperaments must constantly check their impulses, must learn to channel human affection into acceptable outlets, mentoring novices, correspondence with former Vestals, the cultivation of carefully proper friendships with Roman matrons. It is a life of emotional discipline as strict as any physical asceticism. And yet, and this is what those who focus on the scandals miss, most Vestals not only survive, but thrive within these constraints. They find fulfillment in their service, companionship in their sisters, purpose in their unique position. The threat of burial alive looms always in the background, but in the foreground is daily life with its small satisfactions, its moments of transcendence, its quiet rewards. Livia herself has never felt serious temptation to break her vows. Whether this reflects natural temperament, successful conditioning, or simple lack of opportunity, she cannot say. She has observed men, certainly, noted their beauty or wit or kindness, but always with the detachment of someone observing a work of art in a temple she may visit but never enter. The thought of risking her position, her purpose, her life for any individual seems not so much frightening as incomprehensible. But she understands that others might feel differently. She has seen the hunger in younger Vestals' eyes when they watch couples in the forum. She has comforted sisters who wake weeping from dreams they dare not describe. She knows the weight of the vow, how it presses differently on different souls, how what seems easy at 7 or reasonable at 17 can become unbearable at 27. Tomorrow, we will explore what happens when the 30 years are complete, when the vow expires or threatens. But tonight, let us hold in our minds those who failed, who fell, who descended living into darkness, not with condemnation or sensationalism, but with the compassion due to any human who found the weight of divine service too heavy to bear. They too were part of the story, the shadow that gave shape to the light, the cautionary tales that made ordinary faithfulness seem extraordinary. When 30 years end and choice returns. On the morning of her 37th birthday, or rather, the 30th anniversary of her caption, for sacred time supersedes ordinary time, Livia wakes to a sensation she has not felt in 3 decades. The possibility of choice. Today, if she wishes, she may lay aside the stola with its purple border, unwind the 6-fold braids from her hair, step out of the house of the Vestals and into whatever life she can construct from the ashes of the one she never lived. The law is clear on this point. After 30 years of service, a Vestal virgin is released from her vows. She may remain in service if she chooses, continuing until death in the life she knows. Or she may depart, free to marry, to manage her own household, to experience all the ordinary freedoms and constraints of Roman womanhood that she set aside at 7. The choice is entirely hers. Perhaps the first truly free choice she has ever been permitted to make. Let us sit with Livia in the pre-dawn darkness of this momentous morning, feeling the weight of possibility settle upon her shoulders like a cloak she's not sure how to wear. For 30 years, every morning has had its prescribed shape. Rise before dawn, perform ablutions, dress in the sacred garments, tend the flame. But this morning carries a question that transforms routine into decision. Will she do these things because she must, or because she chooses to? The statistics, such as Roman record-keeping provides, suggest that most Vestals choose to remain. Of those who complete their 30 years without scandal, perhaps 1 in 3 departs for civilian life. The others continue in service, moving into emeritus positions, honored, supported, but gradually relieved of the more demanding duties. They become repositories of wisdom, teachers of teachers, living links to the sacred past. But statistics tell us nothing of the internal struggle, the weight of decision, the careful calculations of possibility that must occupy the minds of Vestals approaching this threshold. Livia has been thinking about this moment for years, not constantly, but in quiet intervals between duties, in the sleepless hours when the mind wanders paths usually forbidden. What would life outside look like for a woman who has known only life within? Consider the practical challenges first, for Romans are nothing if not practical. At 37, Livia is past the prime marriageable age. Not impossibly old, Roman women sometimes marry for the first time in their 30s, but certainly at a disadvantage. Most men her age have been married for 20 years, have children approaching adulthood. Those seeking wives look for youth, proven fertility, substantial dowries. What does a former Vestal offer to compete with these attractions? She has wealth, certainly. 30 years of stipends carefully invested, gifts from grateful clients, inheritances from those who remembered the Vestals in their wills. Livia could provide her own dowry and support herself in comfort without any husband's assistance. But wealth alone does not create a life. It merely provides the framework within which life must be constructed. She has status of a peculiar sort. Former Vestal virgin carries weight in Roman society, opens certain doors, commands respect. But it also mocks her as different, set apart, neither fully sacred nor fully ordinary. Would dinner invitations come from curiosity or genuine welcome? Would friendships form naturally or always carry the taint of novelty-seeking? And then there is the question that no one speaks aloud, but everyone thinks. What does a woman who has been virgin for 30 years know of marriage? The physical aspect is only part of it. Bodies can learn what bodies need to know. But the emotional intimacy, the daily negotiations of shared life, the compromise and accommodation that marriage requires, these are skills developed through practice. And Livia has had no practice except in the very different intimacies of communal religious life. Some former Vestals do marry, and successfully. Livia knows the stories, has even corresponded with two who left before her time. Osea, who departed 15 years ago at age 37, married a widower senator who wanted a wife of unblemished reputation to help raise his children. By all accounts, the marriage thrives. She writes of domestic contentments, managing a household, hosting dinners, watching stepchildren grow, with what seems like genuine satisfaction. But Fontea tells a different story. She left 10 years ago full of dreams deferred, only to find that freedom felt more like exile. Her marriage to a merchant lasted barely 2 years before ending in divorce. Now she lives alone in a villa outside Rome, wealthy but isolated, neither Vestal nor matron, caught between worlds. Her letters carry an undertone of regret that no amount of philosophical acceptance quite conceals. These examples weigh on Livia as she contemplates her choice. But there are other considerations beyond the personal. The sacred flame still needs tending. Young Vestals still need teaching. The eternal contract between Rome and its gods still requires maintenance. Can she walk away from this duty simply because the law permits it? Does the legal end of obligation mean the moral end as well? She thinks of the current novices, Quinta, so serious and careful, Julia, bright as flame, but needing constant guidance to channel her energy appropriately, little Claudia, who still cries at night for the mother she barely remembers. Who will guide them if the experienced Vestals all depart when their time comes? Who will preserve the traditions, maintain the standards, embody the continuity that makes the Vestal order more than just a collection of individuals? Yet, against these arguments for staying weighs the simple human desire to know what has been forbidden, to walk through Rome without lictors and ceremony, to eat when hungry rather than at prescribed times, to sleep past dawn simply because the body craves rest, to speak to whomever she wishes without calculating the propriety of every interaction, to discover who Livia might have been if she hadn't become a Vestal at 7. The other senior Vestals have noticed her preoccupation. Caecilia, now in her final years, spoke to her yesterday with characteristic directness. "The choice is harder for those who have served well," she said. "Those who chafed against the restrictions know immediately that they want to leave. Those who found scandal have no choice at all. But those who discovered contentment in service, we torture ourselves with possibilities." "What would you choose?" Livia asked, though she knew Caecilia had made her choice 10 years ago, remaining in service despite completing her obligation. "I chose what I knew over what I didn't," Caecilia replied. "Perhaps that was cowardice, perhaps wisdom. The goddess hasn't told me which." Now, as dawn approaches on this day of decision, Livia performs what might be her last morning ritual as an obligated Vestal. She rises, but notices the rising. She washes, but feels the water on her skin. She dresses, but considers each garment as she puts it on. The stola that has been uniform for 30 years becomes a choice. The braids that have marked her status become a statement. Even walking to the temple carries new weight when she might be walking away from it tomorrow. The flame greets her as always, neither knowing nor caring that this might be goodbye. She feeds it wood, oak this morning, the strong, reliable oak that burns steady and long. She speaks the morning prayers, Words so familiar they usually flow without thought, but today each syllable carries significance. She performs the purification, the blessing, the careful banking of coals that will maintain heat until the next tender arrives. Everything is the same. Everything is different. The awareness of choice transforms routine into ritual, habit into deliberate action. Is this what freedom feels like? This terrible consciousness of alternatives, this weight of responsibility for one's own life. As the day progresses, Livia goes about her duties with heightened attention. She reviews correspondence, settling a dispute over water rights between two of the Vestal properties. She instructs Quinta in the proper proportions for mixing sacred wine. She witnesses the signing of 3 wills, her seal carrying the authority of divine sanction. Each task might be the last time she performs it in an official capacity. At the noon sacrifice, standing with her sisters as the priest offers a white heifer to Jupiter, she watches the smoke rise toward heaven and wonders what prayers rise with it. Does the goddess care whether Livia stays or goes? Does 30 years of faithful service earn the right to choose self over duty? Or does the very ability to frame the question that way indicate she has already chosen? The afternoon brings unexpected clarity. A woman comes to the house seeking sanctuary, not an uncommon occurrence, as the Vestal's threshold offers temporary protection to those fleeing various forms of trouble. This woman, barely more than a girl, has fled an abusive husband. She bears the marks of violence poorly concealed by her stola. She seeks not permanent refuge, the Vestals cannot offer that, but time to arrange passage to relatives in distant Carthage. As Livia arranges temporary accommodation, provides food and clean clothing, writes letters of introduction that will ease the woman's journey, she realizes something fundamental. This work, not just the ritual duties, but the human ones, the ways Vestal authority can shield the vulnerable and support the desperate. This work still needs doing. And she knows how to do it. 30 years have made her expert in the delicate application of sacred power to human problems. Could she help people as effectively outside the order? Perhaps, with her wealth and status. But would they come to her? Would they know to come? The Vestal house is a known refuge, its threshold a recognized sanctuary. A private villa, however wealthy its owner, offers no such automatic protection. As evening approaches, Livia finds herself in the garden where she has spent so many hours in contemplation. The olive tree that sheltered her meditations as a young woman now shelters her as she faces the decision that will shape her remaining years. The fountain plays its eternal music. The roses bloom as they have bloomed every summer of her service. The physical space holds 30 years of memory, 30 years of becoming who she is. And suddenly, quietly, without drama or divine sign, she knows. The choice was made not in this moment, but in all the moments leading to it. Each day she chose to rise and tend the flame. Each year she chose to remain when she could have found reasons to leave. Each decade she chose to deepen rather than merely endure. The life she might have lived exists in imagination only. The life she has lived is written in her bones, her habits, her carefully cultivated skills. She will stay. Not from fear of the unknown, not from failure of imagination, but from recognition that she has become what she was meant to become. The 7-year-old Livia who entered this house exists now only in memory. The 37-year-old Livia who might walk away is a phantom, a path untaken. The real Livia is the one sitting in this garden, at peace with her choice, because it is no choice at all, but simply the continuation of who she has chosen to be, day by day, year by year, for 3 decades of sacred time. Tomorrow she will rise before dawn, because she chooses to. She will tend the flame, because it needs tending, and she knows how. She will guide the novices, manage the properties, witness the wills, offer sanctuary, because these things need doing, and 30 years have made her expert in their doing. The vow may end, but the service continues, transformed from obligation into offering, from duty into gift. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, on this threshold between bound and free, let her sit in the garden as shadows lengthen and early stars appear. Let her feel the weight of choice settle into certainty. Let her know that freedom, truly understood, means not the absence of bonds, but the power to choose which bonds to accept. She has worn the chains of divine service so long they have become wings, and she chooses not to shed them, but to soar. The fading of ancient light. Time moves differently in the house of the Vestals. Empires rise and fall. Dynasties succeed one another in blood and triumph. But the flame burns on, and the women who tend it maintain their ancient rhythm. Yet even the eternal must eventually face the temporal. As Livia enters her 45th year, her 15th as a senior Vestal who chose to remain, she watches shadows gather that no sacred fire can dispel. The changes come slowly at first, like cracks in marble that widen imperceptibly with each season's freeze and thaw. When Livia first took her vows, Rome's gods commanded unquestioned allegiance. Now, strange winds blow from the east, carrying whispers of a crucified God whose followers multiply in the shadows despite periodic persecution. The old certainties that seemed as solid as the Forum's stones begin to shift, and with them, the foundation of everything the Vestals represent. Let us sit with Livia in what will prove to be the twilight not just of her service, but of the Vestal order itself. She doesn't know this yet. How could she? The flame has burned for 1,000 years. Surely it will burn for 1,000 more. But we who drowse in future centuries can see what she cannot. The approaching end of an institution that seemed as permanent as Rome itself. The signs accumulate like autumn leaves, each insignificant alone, but together forming a pattern of decline. Recruitment grows more difficult. Where once patrician families competed for the honor of offering daughters to Vesta, now they find excuses, cite omens, discover sudden religious scruples. The pool of eligible girls shrinks year by year. Those who do enter often come from lesser families, ambitious for the status, but lacking the deep roots in tradition that once sustained generational service. The novices themselves are different. Claudia, now in her 10th year, questions everything with a persistence that would have been unthinkable in Livia's youth. Why must the flame never die, she asks. What would really happen if it went out? Has anyone tested it? The questions aren't rebellious exactly, but they reveal a skepticism that gnaws at the roots of faith like water eroding stone. More troubling are the changes in Rome itself. The emperor, for Rome has long since traded republic for empire, shows less reverence for traditional religion with each passing year. He performs the required rituals, but perfunctorily, his mind clearly elsewhere. The Senate still opens with prayers, but conversations in the forum suggest many senators view these as quaint traditions rather than essential compacts with divine power. Christians move more openly through the city now. Livia sees them sometimes, gathering in houses for their mysterious rites. They claim their God needs no temples, no sacred flames, no virgin priestesses. Their women participate in worship alongside men, not as segregated specialists, but as equal believers. The idea seems chaotic to Roman minds, yet their numbers grow. Even some of the Vestal slaves whisper of resurrection and salvation when they think the priestesses cannot hear. The financial pressures mount as well. The Vestal properties, once among Rome's most valuable, face new taxes and regulations. The stipends that supported the priestesses arrive late and light, eroded by inflation and imperial need. Livia spends increasing time on account books and legal documents, fighting to maintain resources that once flowed freely. The sacred and the secular intertwine in ways that would have horrified earlier generations. Even the physical structures show decline. The temple needs repairs. The imperial treasury claims it cannot afford. The house of the Vestals, for all its grandeur, suffers from settling foundations and water damage. The sacred spring that provides water for rituals runs lower each year. Whether from divine displeasure or simple geological shift, no one can say. Livia authorizes patch after patch, but patches cannot forever substitute for renewal. Yet amid this slow dissolution, the daily work continues. The flame still needs tending. Young women still need training. The gods, whatever their reality, whatever their power, still require their due. Livia finds unexpected comfort in routine as the larger structure creaks around her. If the macrocosm fails, at least the microcosm can maintain its integrity. She thinks often now of her predecessors, especially during the night watches when the temple lies quiet except for the flame's whisper. Did they face similar challenges? Did some ancient Vestal watch the monarchy give way to republic with the same unease Livia feels watching republic's ghost inhabit empire's body? Change is the only constant, philosophy teaches. Yet some changes cut deeper than others. The most painful erosion is of respect. Not disrespect, exactly. Romans still formally honor the Vestals, still grant them their traditional privileges. But the reverence has hollowed out, become performance rather than genuine feeling. Young men no longer lower their eyes when Vestals pass. Magistrates fulfill their obligations to the temple with visible impatience. Even the lictors who accompany Vestals on their journeys seem bored by their duty, chatting among themselves rather than maintaining dignified silence. Livia remembers when a Vestal's presence could silence a room, when their approval or disapproval carried weight in the highest councils. Now they are honored relics, maintained out of tradition rather than conviction. The flame they guard has become symbol, emptied of significance, its meaning forgotten by those who still mechanically support its burning. The final blow comes from within. Achillea, a middle years Vestal recruited from the provinces, brings ideas that would have been heretical a generation ago. She speaks openly of reforms, reducing the service period, allowing Vestals to marry after 20 years, permitting them to tend the flame in shifts rather than maintaining constant presence. She has supporters among the younger priestesses, those who see the old ways as unnecessarily harsh rather than sacredly necessary. We must adapt or perish, Aquila argues in one heated discussion that Livia wishes she could avoid but cannot, given her senior status. The Christians allow their holy women to serve their God without surrendering their entire lives. Why should we demand more? Because we are not Christians, Caecilia replies with asperity. She is in her 70s now, the eldest Vestal, her authority absolute but her energy fading. We serve different gods in different ways. The flame requires what the flame requires. But does it? The question hangs unspoken in the air. If the gods are eternal, why do their demands change? If they are unchanging, why does their worship evolve? These are not questions that admit easy answers, and the Vestals have no theologians trained in such debates. They have only tradition and the weight of centuries, and these grow lighter each year. Livia finds herself in the uncomfortable position of mediator, too senior to side with the young rebels, too honest to pretend the problems don't exist. She crafts compromises that satisfy no one, small modernizations that the conservatives see as betrayal and the reformers dismiss as inadequate. The unity that once characterized the Vestal house fractures into factions, polite but persistent. Personal griefs compound the institutional ones. Caecilia dies on a winter morning, quietly, having tended her last watch the night before. They find her seated in her chair, facing the flame, as if she had simply decided to stop rather than been stopped. Her funeral brings a surprising crowd. Old Romans who remember when tradition meant something, who come to honor not just the woman, but what she represented. Livia becomes the senior Vestal by default rather than design. The weight of leadership in decline presses heavier than leadership in glory ever could. She must maintain standards while acknowledging that the standards themselves face questions. She must inspire faith while harboring doubts. She must prepare successors for a future that grows increasingly uncertain. The young emperor visits once, a state occasion that reveals more than it conceals. He performs the rituals correctly, but without understanding, like an actor who has memorized lines in a foreign language. He asks Livia afterward with genuine curiosity rather than mockery, "Do you truly believe the flame protects Rome? Or do you tend it because you always have?" What can she answer? That belief and practice intertwine so closely she cannot separate them? That the flame protects Rome by making Rome worth protecting, by maintaining continuity with its sacred past. That whether the gods exist matters less than whether humans act as if they do. These subtleties escape the emperor's practical mind. He wants simple answers to complex questions, and Livia has none to give. The nights grow longer, or perhaps she sleeps less. Often she finds herself alone in the temple during hours when younger Vestals should share the watch. They come when reminded, perform their duties adequately, but the voluntary devotion that once characterized the service has evaporated. They are employees rather than priestesses, maintaining a job rather than a calling. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, Livia wonders if she witnesses not just change, but ending. Will there come a day when no virgin tends this flame? When the sacred hearth lies cold, and the gods, if they ever existed, finally turn their faces from Rome? The thought brings not fear, but a strange relief. Even the eternal grows weary of eternity. Yet each dawn she rises, performs the rituals, speaks the prayers, not from hope of reversing decline, but from simple fidelity to what remains. If the Vestal order must end, let it end with dignity rather than abandonment. Let the last flame be tended as carefully as the first. Let the final priestess perform her duties as faithfully as all who came before. She thinks of writing a history, preserving in words what time threatens to erase. But when she takes up the stylus, she finds she has no taste for monument building. The lived experience resists capture in prose. How can she convey the weight of 1,000 small faithfulnesses? The texture of days that differed in detail but cohered in purpose. History records the dramatic, the Vestals who broke their vows, the flames that died, the scandals and punishments. It has little room for quiet devotion sustained across decades. Instead, she focuses on the immediate, training Quinta to perhaps be the last great Vestal, maintaining the properties against economic predation, ensuring the flame burns steady even as the world that gave it meaning transforms beyond recognition. These are small victories against large defeat, but they are what she has to offer. The irony does not escape her. She who chose to remain when she could have left now presides over an order that may not survive to offer future women the same choice. But perhaps that too is fitting. All things end. The only question is how, with bang or whimper, with catastrophe or quiet cessation. Livia hopes for the latter, though history suggests the former is more likely. Tomorrow we will see how it ends, this 1,000-year tradition, this sacred flame that seemed eternal until it wasn't. But tonight, let Livia tend her watch in peace, neither knowing nor needing to know the future. Let her feed oak to flame and prayer to gods who may or may not listen. When eternal flames die with drama, but with document, a simple imperial edict delivered on an autumn morning when the flame burns as it has burned for more than a millennium. Livia, now 53 and the most senior of the remaining Vestals, receives the scroll from a functionary who cannot meet her eyes. She doesn't need to break the seal to know what it contains. The signs have been gathering like storm clouds for months. By order of the Emperor, in recognition of the changing spiritual needs of Rome, and in consultation with the Senate and the new religious authorities, the Order of Vestal Virgins is hereby dissolved. The sacred flame shall be extinguished at sunset on the kalends of November. All properties belonging to the temple shall revert to the imperial treasury. Current Vestals shall receive pensions in accordance with their years of service. The words blur as Livia reads. Not from tears, She is past tears, but from the sheer impossibility of parsing meaning from syllables that unmake a world. How does one dissolve the eternal? How does one schedule the death of the divine? Yet here it is, in proper legal language, with appropriate seals and signatures. The sacred reduced to administrative procedure. She gathers the others in the tablinum. Only 4 remain now. Herself, Quinta, brilliant, devoted Quinta, who deserved better than to preside over endings. Young Claudia, whose questions now seem prophetic. And newest addition Flavia, barely 16, who has served only 3 years. Aquilia left last month, seeing which way the wind blew, accepting a position in the provincial administration, where her organizational skills would be valued and her religious ones forgotten. "How long do we have?" Quinta asks, after Livia reads the edict aloud. 6 weeks. The silence that follows contains centuries. Each woman calculates what 6 weeks means against the weight of lifetimes given in service. For Livia, it is 46 years collapsed into 42 days. For Flavia, it is the abortion of a life barely begun. For all of them, it is the invalidation of everything they have been taught to value. What of the sacred objects? Claudia, ever practical, thinks of logistics even in catastrophe. To be transferred to the imperial treasury for appropriate disposition. Livia tastes bitterness in the bureaucratic euphemism. She can imagine the sacred vessels that have held offerings for centuries melted down for coin, the ancient scrolls burned or sold to collectors, the mysteries profaned by curious eyes that see only curiosity where generations saw divinity. And us, Flavia's voice trembles. At 16, she has no life to return to, no skills beyond the sacred ones that will no longer be valued. Pensions, housing assistance, letters of recommendation for those who seek other employment. Each provision sounds more hollow than the last. How does one recommend a former Vestal? Punctual at sacred duties, reliable in divine service, experienced in maintaining eternal flames? They sit in silence as afternoon light slants through windows that have illuminated this same scene, Vestals in council, for hundreds of years. But never this council, never this decision. There have been reforms before, changes in practice, adaptations to circumstances, but never extinction. Never the formal declaration that Rome no longer requires what Vesta offers. The reasons are not hard to find. The emperor has embraced Christianity. Not formally, that will come later, but in all but name. The old gods embarrass him, their temples and priests reminders of what he sees as primitive superstition. Better to clear them away, to make room for the new God who demands no temples, or rather, whose temples exist in the hearts of believers rather than in stone and flame. But it goes deeper than imperial preference. The Vestals represent an older Rome, a Rome of citizen farmers and sacred boundaries, of traditions maintained because ancestors maintained them. The new Rome, cosmopolitan, diverse, skeptical, has no room for virgin priestesses tending fires that protect borders already breached by commerce and conversion. The flame guards nothing, because there is nothing left to guard, or nothing that believes it needs guarding. The next weeks pass in a strange suspension between life and death. They continue their duties. The flame still burns after all, and as long as it burns, it must be tended. But everything carries the weight of finality. Each morning prayer is one fewer remaining. Each ritual performed is a step closer to never performing it again. The sacred routines that once structured time now counted down like a death watch. Citizens come to pay respects, some sincere, others merely curious. Old women who remember when Vestals were truly revered bring offerings and weep. Young people come to gawk at living anachronisms as they might visit exotic animals before the circus leaves town. The temple becomes a site of premature nostalgia, mourned before it dies. The emperor himself visits once, a careful political gesture meant to show respect while confirming change. He speaks of honoring the past while embracing the future, of maintaining what is valuable in tradition while discarding what has become mere superstition. His words are measured, diplomatic, empty. Livia receives him with equal emptiness, performing the host's role as she has performed it for decades, knowing this is theater rather than faith. "You have served Rome well," he tells her privately, after the public ceremonies. "No one questions your devotion or your dignity. But times change. Surely you must see that." "I see many things, Augustus," she replies, using his title rather than his name, maintaining distance even in capitulation. "I see 1,000 years of unbroken service ending not in catastrophe, but in indifference. I see sacred vows dissolved by secular decree. I see Rome choosing to break its oldest compact with the divine. Yes, I see change. Whether it is wisdom or folly, only time will tell." He has no answer to that, and she expects none. They understand each other perfectly. He, the pragmatist, dismantling what no longer serves power. She, the guardian of mysteries he cannot comprehend, and therefore cannot value. Neither is villain, both are actors in a drama whose end was perhaps inevitable from the moment Rome chose empire over republic, expansion over tradition, the new over the old. The practical matters consume more time than the spiritual ones. The Vestal properties must be inventoried, transferred, their tenants notified of new ownership. The sacred objects must be catalogued, packed, delivered to imperial warehouses, where they will gather dust among the spoils of conquered nations. The archives present particular difficulty. So many secrets, so many wills, so many documents that families believed would remain inviolate forever. Livia oversees the destruction of the most sensitive materials. Better that certain secrets die than fall into inappropriate hands. She burns letters that could destroy reputations, wills that might overturn fortunes, prophecies that could unsettle the state. The smoke rises thick and black, carrying with it the accumulated trust of centuries. Some knowledge is too dangerous to survive its context. The younger Vestals must be provided for. Quinta, at 35, might yet marry if she chooses, though her prospects dim with each day. Livia writes letters to respectable widowers, hints at dowries, tries to craft futures from the wreckage of vocations. Claudia, ever practical, has already secured a position as secretary to a senator's wife, her literacy and discretion valued even if her sacred status is not. Young Flavia poses the greatest challenge, too young to have developed secular skills, too marked by her brief service to easily blend into ordinary life. I could continue tending flame elsewhere, Flavia suggests one evening, desperate, in a private shrine or in one of the countryside temples that might survive longer. There is no elsewhere, Livia tells her gently. When we extinguish this flame, we extinguish the last. The countryside temples are already closed or converted. Private shrines violate the new laws. What we are ending here is not just our service, but the possibility of service. The girl weeps then, as Livia cannot. 16 years old, chosen for a life that will not exist by the time she would have completed it. The cruelty is not intentional. The emperor probably never considered the individual women affected by his grand theological restructuring. But cruelty without malice cuts as deep as any other. As November approaches, Livia makes her own arrangements. The pension is generous. The emperor is not ungenerous, merely indifferent. She could live comfortably in Rome, or retire to a villa in the countryside. Several former Vestals who left before the dissolution offer her accommodation, companionship, the solace of shared understanding. But she finds she has no taste for aftermath. When one has been the last guardian of the eternal, what does one do with time that is merely temporal? The final week brings unexpected visitors. Former Vestals return from wherever life has taken them, drawn by the need to witness ending. Women who left decades ago stand again in the temple, aged and changed, but still bearing the indefinable mark of those who once served. They share memories, perform unauthorized rituals, create from their gathering a momentary resurrection of what is dying. On the last night, Livia takes the final watch alone. She has insisted on this, and the others, understanding, do not contest it. The temple is empty now of all but the essential: the flame, the altar, the simple tools of tending. Everything else has been removed, leaving spaces that echo with absence. She sits where she has sat 10,000 times before, watching flame dance on ancient stone. But tonight she watches differently, memorizing each flicker, each shadow, each small sound of wood consumed by fire. Tomorrow, the engineers will come to ensure the flame's extinction is complete and safe. Even sacred death must follow proper procedures. But tonight it lives, and she with it, two anachronisms keeping company in the dark. She thinks of all the women who have sat this watch before her. Their names scroll through memory, some remembered by history, most forgotten, all faithful to their moment of service. She thinks of the novices who will never be, the flames that will never again be lit from this source, the prayers that will find no future voices. The weight of ending presses down like stone. Yet, as dawn approaches, her last dawn as Vestal, she finds unexpected peace. All things end. The only variation is how. The Vestal order dies not in scandal or catastrophe, but in dignified obsolescence, maintained to its last moment by women who understood their duty, even when the world no longer understood them. There is honor in that, perhaps even a kind of victory. When the sun rises, she performs the morning ritual one last time. The prayers sound different when you know they will not be repeated, each word carrying the weight of finality. She tends the flame carefully, feeding it well, ensuring it burns bright and steady for its last day. Let no one say the final Vestal neglected her duty. The others arrive as morning advances. Together they perform the daily offices, their voices blending in harmonies practiced across years. Even Flavia, young as she is, knows her parts perfectly. They move through the patterns of service like dancers whose music is ending, each gesture precise, each moment honored. As afternoon wanes toward evening, the officials arrive. Soldiers to maintain order, though no disorder threatens. Engineers to supervise the extinguishing. Scribes to record that all was done properly. The emperor himself does not attend. That would grant too much importance to what he wants Rome to forget. Instead, lesser functionaries manage the death of the divine. It is time, the chief engineer says as sunset approaches. He is not unkind, merely efficient. This is a task to him, nothing more. Livia nods. She has prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in her mind, yet still her hands tremble as she takes up the bronze vessel filled with water from the sacred spring. The others stand behind her, witnesses to ending. Beyond the temple, a crowd has gathered, silent, uncertain whether they watch history or tragedy or both. The water is cold in the vessel, heavy with more than physical weight. Livia stands before the flame that has burned since before Rome was Rome, that has outlasted kingdoms and republics and will not outlast this empire. She speaks no final prayer. What words could suffice? Instead, she simply pours. The hiss of extinguished fire fills the temple like a dying breath. Steam rises, carrying with it the last exhalation of the sacred. The flame fights briefly, flaring up as if in protest, then subsides into wet ash and darkness. The silence that follows is absolute, as if the world itself has paused to acknowledge ending. "It is done," Livia says, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She sets down the empty vessel with careful precision, a final act of ritual in a place that will know no more rituals. The officials move in then, efficient in their dismantling. The Vestals are escorted out, gently but firmly, their presence no longer required or desired. Livia looks back once at the temple threshold. In the gathering dusk, it looks already ancient, already ruined, though its stones still stand straight. Tomorrow they will begin converting it to secular use, but tonight it stands empty, its purpose extinguished with its flame. Outside, the crowd disperses slowly, unsure what they have witnessed or what it means. Some weep, some shrug, some hurry home to dinners grown cold. The Vestals, too, separate, each to whatever future they have managed to arrange. They embrace briefly, formally, the habits of sacred distance hard to break even in ending. Livia walks through Rome's streets one last time as a Vestal, though she wears no sacred garments, claims no privileges, commands no respect. She is already what tomorrow she will wake to be. A woman without definition, a guardian without anything to guard, a servant whose service is no longer required. The flame is dead. The goddess, if she ever lived, has withdrawn. Rome continues, but it is no longer the Rome that needed Vestals, and perhaps that is answer enough. She does not look back. The past is ash now, and the future uncertain. But between them stands this moment, this breath, this step, and then another, carrying her away from what was toward whatever might be. The last watch is ended. The eternal flame is dark, and Livia, last of the Vestal virgins, walks into history's shadow, her duty finally, irreversibly done. And so, dear dreamer, we come to the end of our vigil. The flame that lit our journey through centuries now glows only in memory, its last ember fading as your consciousness hovers between sleeping and waking. But perhaps that is fitting, to speak of endings while you drift toward dreams, to tell of extinction while you approach the small death of sleep that makes tomorrow possible. What have we witnessed in our drowsy wandering through sacred time? A flame that burned for 1,000 years, tended by women who gave their lives to its service. We have seen 7-year-old girls become guardians of eternity, virgin priestesses wielding power through restriction, faith sustained through decades of repetition. We have watched some fall to temptation and earth, others rise to influence beyond what their bonds should have allowed. We have stood with Livia as she chose service over freedom, and stood with her again as service itself dissolved into history. The story of the Vestals is many stories braided together like their sacred hair. Stories of power and powerlessness, of choice constrained and duty embraced, of the sacred persisting until the world no longer had room for their particular holiness. It is a story without simple morals or easy lessons, resistant to the categories we might wish to impose upon it. Were they victims of a patriarchal system that sacrificed girls to abstract ideals? Were they privileged women who found authority through accepting limitation? Were they genuine servants of the divine, or performers in an elaborate social theater? They were all of these and none of them, or rather, they were human beings navigating the space between mortal flesh and immortal calling. Sleep comes to claim you soon, but before it does, consider what remains when sacred flames die. The temple of Vesta stands empty now in our imagining, its hearth cold, its purpose ended. Yet something persists, not in stone or flame, but in the shape left by their absence. Every institution that ends leaves such a shape, a phantom presence defined by what is no longer there. The Vestals vanished into history, but history cannot forget them. They trouble our dreams with questions about service and freedom, about the price of purity and the value of dedication. In your drowsing state, you might see them still, white figures moving through Roman streets that shimmer between ancient stone and modern memory. There goes young Claudia, asking her dangerous questions. There walks Quinta, brilliant and devoted, robbed of the future her talents deserved. There sits Caecilia in her final watch, facing the flame that outlived her by so little. And there stands Livia, pouring sacred water on sacred fire, ending what seemed eternal with her own obedient hands. But do not grieve too deeply for them, these guardians of vanished flame. They knew what we sometimes forget, that nothing mortal is truly eternal, that every institution carries within itself the seeds of its own ending. The wonder is not that the Vestal flame eventually died, but that it burned so long, sustained by the breath and bodies of countless women who found meaning in its tending. 1,000 years of unbroken service is not failure, but triumph, even if it ends in ash. What they guarded was never really fire. Fire was merely the medium, the visible sign of invisible commitment. What they truly tended was the idea that some things matter more than individual desire, that community sometimes requires sacrifice, that the sacred demands precision and patience and the daily return to duty. These ideas did not die when the flame was extinguished. They transformed, found new forms, new guardians, new expressions. The Vestals ended, but Vestalhood, the principle of sacred service, continues wherever humans choose dedication over comfort, whenever we tend what we have been given to tend. In your approaching dreams, you might find yourself in that circular temple, sitting where Livia sat through 10,000 nights. The flame before you burns or does not burn. In dreams, such distinctions matter less than feeling. What matters is the watching, the willingness to keep vigil, the acceptance of your post, whether for an hour or a lifetime. We are all Vestals of something, all guardians of flames we did not light but must not let die on our watch. Some tend literal fires, others metaphorical ones, traditions, values, relationships, arts, memories that require feeding lest they gutter into darkness. The tragedy of the Vestals was not their ending, but the world's failure to value what they offered before it was too late. By the time Rome extinguished their flame, it had already forgotten why it burned. The forms persisted past the understanding, ritual outline without animating faith. Perhaps that too is a lesson as you drift toward unconsciousness, to treasure what we guard while we still comprehend its worth, to tend our flames with full knowledge of why they matter. But now sleep reaches for you with insistent fingers, and who are we to resist that gentle tyrant? Let your eyes close fully now. Let consciousness fade like a well-tended flame allowed finally to rest. In your dreams tonight, you might walk those ancient streets, might climb those worn stone steps, might sit in vigil by a fire that burns eternal in the country of sleep, where all extinguished things live on. Dream of Livia, who found freedom in bonds and meaning in limits. Dream of all the nameless ones who served faithfully and vanished without record, save the continuing flame. Dream of endings that are also transformations, of last watches that become first memories, of sacred duties completed with dignity in the face of obsolescence. Dream of yourself as keeper of whatever flame you tend, knowing now that all fires die, but that the tending itself is immortal. The Vestals are gone. Their temple stands empty. Their flame is ash and shadow. But in your dreams tonight, and in the drowsy space between sleep and waking where we have wandered together, they continue their eternal watch. The sacred persists in the spaces between breath, in the pause between heartbeats, in the moment between closing eyes and opening dreams. Sleep now, dear dreamer. Your vigil here is ended, though others await in the waking world. Let the last light fade. Let time dissolve into timelessness. Let the boundaries between then and now, between sacred and profane, between duty and desire, blur into the sweet confusion of dreams. The Vestals release you from attendance. The goddess, if she ever was, requires no more watching tonight. Rest, dream, and perhaps, in some corner of your sleeping mind, a flame continues to burn, tended by white-clad figures who know that some things are worth a lifetime's dedication, even if, especially if, they end. The eternal flame is extinguished. Long may it burn in memory, in dream, in the phantom light that glows behind closed eyelids as you fall, finally and fully, asleep.